It's April 16th, 2001, and we're in Boulder, Colorado. And we have the wonderful privilege of being with Ken Wilber in his home, and we're going to get to spend some time asking him some questions and listening to what he has to say.
Yeah.
So, Ken, let's start out talking about the Integral Institute. I wanted to know how I was doing in general, especially on the practical and pragmatic level in the wake of what's been happening in the stock market and people pulling money out, and how that's affected what you've been doing with II.
Well, you've also had, this can be a real dialogue because of the experiences you've had with Enlightenment.com, yes?
Yes.
There are many ways to talk about the immediate impact it had on Integral Institute. One of them is that basically we lost $100 million in pledges in about a 8-month period. And it's not every day you lose $100 million. It left me feeling a little cranky and testy.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what it's actually done, the scope of Integral Institute hasn't changed. And the money itself, we still have several other pledges lined up for, frankly, comparable amounts. And we'll know how these unfold over the next year. The economic situation, of course, could not be worse. It's just a crying shame that the bubble burst during this period. A lot of companies that should have gone out of business went out of business, but it took down a lot of work that was really top-notch and didn't deserve to go out in that ignoble a fashion.
So are any of your projects at II still going forward, like, let's say, the Encyclopedia of Transformation?
Sure. Yeah, we're still funding that. We're still carrying the Human Change Process core team forward. We also refer to that as the Human Transformation team. They're working on an Encyclopedia of Human Transformation, a complete literature review of all known forms of transformation for human beings. Because transformation seems to be a major concept that everybody talks about, but we really don't have a good literature review on what's out there, number one. And number two, the type of research. What evidence is there that any of these things that say they transform people actually transform people? And there are a lot of different ways you can at least try to look at that and get a handle on it. And we're certainly doing that.
So in the meantime, though, let's say the grants that people could write to for II, none of that's happening while...
No. What's happening right now is one of the main things we wanted to do with that original $100 million was to get it to as many people as possible doing work in this field, the general field of integral studies and integral endeavors. And that's one of the reasons that I started Integral Institute, was to act as a funding source for people doing this kind of work, because the marketplace doesn't reward truly integral studies at all. It rewards sort of new age approaches to it. It rewards sort of the experiential workshop approach, as it were. It rewards the green meme and the purple meme and everything in between, but it does not reward truly integral studies. So the only way we're going to get real work done in that field is, frankly, if we have funding agencies that will do that. And then once the real work is done and the research is done, and you start producing really solid texts and presentations and articles and research, then we can create a market off of that. That's going to be probably 3 years from now. So what we've done at Integral Institute, the biggest change in our orientation happened not because of the market, but quite independent of that. It's a change we would have made whether the market went up or down. And that is, we went from being a kind of community of some 400 founding members to focusing more on producing what we call integral product, actual books, texts, academic material in each of the 10 branches. So we're working on books in, for example, what is integral politics, what is integral business, integral medicine, integral law. Because what we found is that because there were no really strong statements about an integral approach to any of these fields.
Mm-hmm. Which is one of the reasons why academics can ignore it completely.
It can ignore it completely. And the other thing we found is that most people with very, very good intentions would simply take what they're doing and call it integral, when it really wasn't. They were leaving out certain aspects of the human condition that ought not to be left out. And we could demonstrate that to them, and they would say, okay, I guess what I'm doing is not integral. So before we can build community or create a market or have a web presence or have conferences, we have to produce specific texts in each of these 10 branches put together by one of our core teams of recognized scholars and researchers, saying this is our best shot as an opening statement about what integral business is, integral politics, integral education, integral medicine, integral law, integral psychology, integral spirituality, and so on.
So that may answer this next question. I got quite a few questions from graduate students in different areas saying, I'm an anthropology grad student, and what do I do to try to bring an all quadrants, all level approach into my university without completely alienating the powers that be? Or how can a psychology graduate student become more involved with integral studies and help booster the efforts in a green meme school? And it's sort of like they're dying out there for these kind of supporting materials.
That's exactly what we found. And until we have a series of really well done, well documented textbooks, if you will, on here's integral anthropology, here's integral law and criminal justice, here's integral medicine. Until we have these series of statements, the field has no traction. It has no way to really move forward. Whereas if you do have a book on integral approaches to education, for example, and it's a textbook with 8 authors, and it's we plan on having these things be 300 and 400 pages long. We want to make a real academic statement to begin with. And again, this is not the final word, it's the opening word. It's our first approximation of what an integral approach would actually look like. It is truly all quadrant, all level, all lines, all states. Anything less than that's not going to be integral. And then once we have this kind of book on, let's say, integral anthropology, and this student calls up and says, I'm going to Arizona State, for example, I would like to take an all quadrant, all level, all line approach to anthropological research. My professors think I'm nuts. What should I do? When we say, well, give them this 400-page textbook, and here's 300 references, and here's supporting documents, and that will give them something to look at and respond to. And if they have criticisms of it, we'd love to hear it, because we're going to keep refining these things over the years. But we have to have a statement, a really strong academic statement to begin with, because otherwise the field is simply going nowhere, and it has gone nowhere in 30 years.
So on top of the kind of the orienting framework that you've set up, you're really hoping to fill it out so that, the reality is that if you go into Barnes & Noble's, you find your works in the New Age section. That must be really galling.
It would be, except the New Age section gets 80% more traffic than any other section.
There you go. What about audio recordings of an essential Ken Wilber? One person wrote it and said, I'm not the kind of person that absorbs reading words. I need it from other modalities. Have you thought about re-going through all of your stuff again and creating a set of audio material for at least kind of the basic premises?
Well, one of the things that we want to do is get into multimedia as fast as we possibly can. And I can go back and give an example of the approach that Integral Institute is taking, and how that eventually will have a lot of different outlets other than textbooks, even though I'm saying we want to emphasize textbooks. That's not going to be the only thing we're doing. So we have a core team in Integral Business branch, and it's 7 or 8 very, very good people, including Leo Burke, who was at Motorola University, and Fred Studier, who's consultant at Bain Associates, very, very large consulting firm in California, Tony Schwartz with Fast Company, Bob Richards, who's the CF of our business group, Fred Kaufman, who was Peter Senger's main collaborator when they founded the Organizational Learning Center at MIT School of Business. These are some very, very sharp people. And what they've done, basically, Michael Putz at Cisco, what they've done is what we're trying to get each of the core teams to do, which is they can start by using my broad framework of all quadrants, all levels, all lines. But then based on their decades of experience in the field, in this case of business, to actually sit down and fill in all the details with actual concrete data from the world of business. And then what they're doing right now, for example, is, and they've been meeting for almost 18 months now, is creating PowerPoint presentations of what integral business leadership looks like. And these are very sophisticated presentations. Bob Richards just gave one down at Esalen conference on integral capitalism, for example. And it was a big hit down there. It went over really, really well, and people really understood why you have to have an all quadrant, all level, all line approach to any type of integral approach to economics. And so that kind of presentation has a much better chance of helping people understand these integral approaches than, you know, the 300 or 400 page textbook. So we want to try to do a very broad range of material, from the very, very dense to the very, you know, presentable.
Well, that would be in line with your general theoretical approach anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, hit it from lots of different angles,
Right.
as it were.
Right.
When will volume 2 of your trilogy be out?
Basically, the idea was to do one volume every 10 years.
Okay, so you got some time.
A little bit of time, and not as much as I liked. What happened, of course, is the Integral Institute came along, and it's really took really about the last 2 years of
a lot of your
a lot of my time.
Are you happy with your leadership of Integral Institute?
I am.
So you feel you're leading it? I mean, all along you said you wanted to try to lead it from the second tier way, which might look a little bit disorganized.
Right.
Maybe disorganized is the wrong word, but
no, I think it does, because what happens is, first of all, everybody that's involved in this has been very kind of open and flexible and easygoing about it, because the fact is there are no second-tier organizations out there. So
the Vatican?
Huh?
The Vatican?
I stand corrected. And so a lot of people have a great deal of experience in OD, organizational development, with first-tier companies. And one of my main jobs is it's actually been more than a leader. It's been kind of a curmudgeon, a putting on the brake, and saying, wait a minute, we can't organize this along these first-tier principles. We can't use standard organizational development material for this.
We're not going to know what it looks like.
Well, that's the thing. So what we do have to do is just continue to put second-tier people together in a room and have them thrash out these various ideas. And you've been to meetings. That's basically what we do with the general meetings. Is we have as many second-tier people as we can find. We put them in a room. We say, here's the topic of conversation, and see what comes out of that group. And then eventually we try to translate that into institutional forms. And so, okay, now here's going to be the infrastructure in terms of what we have set up. Now, the main thing that makes it difficult for me in any position of leadership is balancing this funding situation. And that's been complicated because, on the one hand, there's this exorbitant amounts of money that have been pledged. But on the other hand, of course, it could all fall apart, as some of it has already done.
Right.
So this makes it almost impossible to do any planning, frankly, that lasts much more than a couple of weeks, because that's how often the situation changes. So a lot of people sit down and say, you know, we have to have a mission statement, we have to have a strategy for the next 6 months, and I'll go, forget it. It's an absolute waste of time to do that. And so the only friction I've really had in the last year and a half is because I had to put the brake on some of these things. I think some people think that I'm not, you know, kind of getting with the program as much as we could, but it's really not the case. The situation changes dramatically every couple of weeks, and we have to be very flexible to adapt to that, because it dramatically changes what we plan on doing. So for the next 3 years or so, we're putting all of our resources into these core teams to produce integral texts. And then once those are out, all these other things will start to flow around that.
The thing about text is, though, I mean, your material, one of the criticisms is that everything is in 100 different places, including the footnotes.
Right.
I mean, it seems that some sort of hyperlinked way of learning that's different or new. I mean, you know, text is words following each other, lines sequentially. There's got to be, it would seem that there would have to be a new mode of learning or apprehending these materials other than just trying to force it into the old boxes.
We hope so. I would like to see really three-dimensional hyperlinked, four-dimensional hyperlinked presentations.
And maybe the web eventually will be good for stuff like that, but we don't know how to do it yet.
Absolutely, but we have to go back and have to start at square one. And the simple fact is, 99% of the education that goes on in this country goes on universities that use textbooks. And until we can make a statement at that level, we're not able to play fastball in this game. And all of these consciousness studies and integral studies will remain exactly where they are now, which frankly are sort of sideshows that nobody really takes seriously. It's certainly not in any positions of power in terms of the educational system or the political system or the business system. The impact of transpersonal and consciousness studies and so on is absolutely minimal. It just hasn't had any effect outside of very small areas, basically. Now, I'm very fond of what transpersonal and consciousness studies and alternative approaches have been able to do in their own realm. But they have not been able to break out of that realm. And so we're not going to go back in and just repeat the same stuff for the last 30 years that hasn't worked, basically. So what we want to do is go back and say, okay, what do we have to do to get this into Harvard? What do we have to do to get this into MIT? What do we have to do to get this into Berkeley, and so on? That's why at Integral Institute we're working with a lot of people from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, such as Bob Keegan, Suzanne Cook-Reuter, Jeffrey Stewart, Kurt Fisher is connected. And we're trying to build bridges with these organizations and say, look, what type of material do you take seriously? And what do we have to do to make you take this material seriously?
But I'm reminded of that Max Planck quote where he says that the old generation will never get it. You have to wait till that generation dies and a new generation grows up.
Right.
That's used to the new, I won't say the P word.
That's right.
But you think there's any way to really get into those guys that are in Harvard?
To some degree, sure. And one of the reasons,
if it's good enough, if it makes sense, if they're kind of presented with the obviousness of the logical coherence and the fullness of it, some of them will go, hey, this is real.
Yes, now it's generally true what you say, which is what Max Planck is generally credited with saying, which is that old paradigms die when the believers in old paradigms die. And I paraphrase that as the knowledge quest proceeds funeral by funeral. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of the old non-integral people are already dying off. Our generation will relate to this. Boomers will relate to it, even though most of the boomers are still green meme. They've been at the green meme for 30 years, and they're ready to exit into yellow and second tier and more integral approaches. And so if you go in, particularly with developmental studies, and you do what Suzanne Cook-Reuter has done, for example, with Jane Lovinger's work, which is to go in, use her sentence completion test, and point out that there are higher stages of self-development than Jane Lovinger spotted. And she can demonstrate this using research and evidence that can be repeated. People take that seriously. She came out of Harvard Graduate School doing that. Robert Keegan, who is a member of Integral Institute, and he's the first tenured professor. They created a chair for him in adult development at Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's a very valued member of Integral Institute. And these people take what we're doing very, very seriously. So that's the kind of approach we want to do. We're not saying other approaches are bad or wrong. It's just this approaching the powers that be hasn't been done seriously enough by our field. We kind of stayed on the fringe and had our workshops and seminars and conferences, and nobody's listened to us. So we want to say that's nice, but we're going to try this other stuff too. And what we need here is research and evidence, and that's why one of the things we're doing is funding research in human transformation after we complete this literature review.
I haven't seen the rewritten Boomeritis in novel form.
Yeah.
But aren't you afraid that by putting something out that's likely to antagonize people, rightly or wrongly, that you end up jeopardizing your larger purpose?
Well, certainly, if all it does is antagonize people and doesn't mobilize or offer any way out. So who did you, in terms of antagonizing people, were you thinking of the postmodernists or something?
Well, I'm thinking about, I haven't seen it,
but
when I read Boomeritis, the draft,
right.
It was clear that some people were going to get ticked off at you.
Right.
And if academia is also melds with the people who will get ticked off, and what you're trying to do is work your way into academia, this would seem to be a little bit of maybe self-sabotage.
Yes, if that's all it did, I would agree. That's quite right. What the main target of criticism of Boomeritis is the extreme postmodernists. And this is a version of basically the green meme taken to extremes, what I call the mean green meme. It's a pathological version of healthy green. Healthy green has done an enormous number of positive things. It brought in civil rights, it brought in feminism, it brought in environmental reform. Every meme, every stage, every level has something very, very important to contribute. And green had all of these fantastic contributions for 30 years. Like every stage, level, or meme, it also has its downside. And the downside expresses itself in this extreme deconstructive postmodernism. And for 30 years, that deconstructive postmodernism has dominated Academia. It's absolutely been the dominant voice in all forms of academia, with the sole exception of hard physical sciences that didn't give a shit about postmodernists in one way or another. But the postmodernists claimed that science was completely patriarchal, oppressive, and so on. Boomeritis is but now in academia, people are sick and tired of extreme postmodernism. It's run its course. Everybody is sick of it. Nobody knows what to do. Boomeritis was timed to aim specifically and address that one issue, which is, here's a critique of extreme postmodernism that shows how it got started, shows the damage that it caused, and shows a way out. And it's meant specifically, I would not have written this book 20 years ago, because the green meme had not run its course. All I would have gotten was nothing but vilified for doing it. But there's so many people that see the truth of the general criticism that they agree with me. And I sent it out to 50 people, including, frankly, half the people that I was criticizing. Mm-hmm. And I expected to get an onslaught of angry stuff. Of the 50 people I sent it out to, 48 wrote back that they agreed with every single thing I said. And I was actually shocked, because I thought, oh, I must have done, they can't have read the book. I'll wait a minute. And the two people that disagreed with it were not the people that were attacked. They had trouble with it for some other reasons. People see it, they see the argument, they go, you know what, it's right. We've got to stop this. It's time to move on. And it gives them a way out. It's a very positive statement, unlike what postmodernism itself did, which is deconstruct everything and put nothing in its place. This deconstructs deconstruction by offering a positive, integral approach. You can actually go out and start applying this approach and produce real research, real effects that can change business, change education, change medicine, and so on. So it's a very positive book in that sense.
And it'll be out in the fall?
Yeah, about this time next year.
Oh, great.
This is the beginning of the second section of the interview, lasting through track 11. Here, the discussion turns to Ken Wilber's basic theory and methodology. We start with a discussion of the philosopher Albert North Whitehead, and how Ken's views on inner subjectivity are different than Whitehead's. We then cover a variety of ground, from what Ken calls the two truths doctrine, to reincarnation, to the general way that Ken always tries to incorporate as much that is true from as many sources as possible.
Okay, let's switch tacks, if we may, and talk a little bit about different theoretical aspects of your work. The first one is, I've been reading some of the stuff on holons and intersubjectivity, and the disagreements and Whitehead and Quincy and prehension and all this stuff. Right. And I'm not very versed in this stuff, but as I read it, it almost feels to me like this is heading towards, the scholastic arguments about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Right. It seems like there's no way to prove any of this at this point, and yeah, maybe you could get a theory that was a little bit more balanced and elegant, a little bit more in line with Occam's razor, but it seems to me that this could be kind of a theoretical cul-de-sac where you, for example, could end up spending a lot of, your time arguing about, the prehension of quarks, and it's like, who the hell knows? Right. What's the point of all this?
Well, I think that's a good point. But I'll give you one example of why it's not just how many angels dancing on the head of a pin, and why Whitehead does not have a truly transpersonal, spiritual understanding of inner subjectivity. Whitehead pointed out that in the real world, there can be no simultaneity for two different subjects. In other words, your subjectivity and my subjectivity can never be co-present with each other. And his reasoning went as follows. By the time I say something, and it gets to you, so that you perceive my present, it's already passed. Sure. So for Whitehead, memory and perception are basically the same thing. There is no simultaneous now for any two subjects anywhere in the universe. Now, in the manifest realm, he's right. Unless you're going to start postulating faster than light information transfer, in the manifest realm, there is no simultaneity for two subjects. Now, what that really means is there's no real intersubjectivity. All we're really dealing with each other is memories and shades of the past. We can never be present for each other in any radical, true sense.
So monads?
Huh?
In effect, monads?
Monads, windowless monads in a certain sense, but for Whitehead, the subject prehends an object, so it's relational. But the two subjects together, one subject cannot prehend its contemporaries, only its ancestors. So there is no simultaneity for Whitehead. Now, I agree with him in the manifest realm that that's correct. And neither De Quincey nor David Ray Griffin nor any other Whiteheadian disagrees with Whitehead on that. They're stuck with the fact that they're...
Well, that's a great segue for this question asked by a fellow named John Silas, who I think you might know. And let me just read this one. The issue I circle around most frequently and find increasingly difficult to reconcile concerns the relationship between the nature of philosophical and intellectual inquiry and the Buddha mind, prior mind, or the true nature of the mind spoken of as the point of realization in many of the non-dual traditions, including particularly Dzogchen. Namkhai Norbu, probably the world's most renowned Dzogchen teacher, states that although philosophies come and go and intellectual answers rise and fall, they are transient, distracting, and do not lead to any kind of satisfactory or worthwhile understanding. Rather, genuine knowledge and its resulting liberation arises from simply observing the mind and body and the energy of which they are composed to identify the mirror condition beneath. How then might this be reconciled with both the direction and purpose of your developmental model, if at all, and what are the consequences in your view if these perspectives do not, in fact, coincide? Many thanks and much love to you, John Silas.
Excellent points, and again, it's why we have to come back to, the only way we can answer that is to again rely on the two truths doctrine, the notion that there is a relative truth in the world of Maya and manifestation, but that underlying all of that there is an absolute or an ultimate or a non-dual truth. And when Namkhai Norbu is talking about the nature of the mind, he's talking about absolute truth, ultimate non-dual truth, which is the truth of one's ever-present awareness, moment to moment. That can be investigated quite regardless of what your philosophy is or your psychology is and so on.
Just shut up and look.
Shut up and look. And that's the basic fundamental instruction for the non-dual schools. It's just shut the fuck up and look.
The injunction that you can test.
The injunction carries, it's a little more specific. The ultimate injunction for the non-dual realization is, there is not that you can get to a state where you have a non-dual awareness, but that there's something about your state right now that is already 100% aware of it.
Right.
So all we're going to do is keep pointing to it until you see it. We're not going to bring anything into existence that isn't already here 100%. If you hear my voice and see the table and you're noticing sounds that are going on, that is the enlightened mind. That is 100% of the enlightened mind. The only reason you don't go, wow, I see it, is that you're too distracted by the objects that are occurring in that mind, moment to moment. Right. So you focus on the objects passing by, and you forget who the actual seer is or the witness of these objects. And so that appears that it's not present, but in fact it's ever present. But it doesn't mean that we can therefore ignore truths in the relative realm. And there are two reasons. One, even though ever-present awareness is by definition ever-present, it's present in quarks. It's present at every stage of development. What we don't know is if at least a certain minimum degree of psychological development is required in order to be able to realize Satori, or the nature of the mind. So, for example, can a worm have this realization? We're not asking whether a worm has Buddha mind. All sentient beings have Buddha mind. We're asking, can it self-consciously realize? Can it have Satori? Most people say worms can't have Satoris. Carrots, no. Deer, probably not. When can you actually have this realization of one mind? And that's where psychological development plays an important part. Because, frankly, in my own opinion, that there are two things that we have to address. One is having Satori as a temporary, brief, altered state, and then versus having it as a permanent realization. And I believe the evidence to date suggests that a person can have an altered state, a transpersonal altered state, at almost any stage of development. Even infants have, waking, dreaming, and deep sleep states. So they have access to these gross, subtle, and causal states. But infants can't stabilize that realization. They cannot convert it into a permanent, constant witnessing or non-dual awareness. At what point can you start to convert it into permanent realization? I believe the evidence suggests a minimum requirement is second-tier psychological development to convert a passing state into a permanent trait of realization. That's an empirical question for us to find out. That's what we're going to actually try to get some evidence on, so we can help people move down this path, as best they possibly can. It's pretty clear that low levels of development cannot permanently realize Satori. So this is where all of a sudden we can't just dismiss the relative realm. We can't just dismiss psychological stages, because it appears that they're going to have an important role to play in how well we can realize this non-dual nature of the mind. So that's one part about it. The second part is that even if somebody has a very powerful and permanent realization of the non-dual, ever-present mind, they still have to manifest and express that through their conventional personality and their conventional philosophy. And the more balanced and integral and sort of full-bodied their philosophy, the more adequate they're going to be in conveying it and helping to make sense of the world. Because it doesn't really help a whole lot to have a great understanding of the nature of the mind if you can't convert that into educational policies or policies for business or politics or real world where real human beings live. So in addition to having an understanding of an awakening to absolute non-dual nature of the mind, you want to have an expression that is as integral and comprehensive as possible, because it's going to be more effective in the real world. So in the best of all possible worlds, we want to combine both the relative and the non-dual to give a sort of a more comprehensive approach to the topic.
What are your views on reincarnation or other ways in which levels of consciousness development are transmitted from one life to another?
Yeah.
Are we all born at the same level and with the same capacity? Do we get to continue our work in more than one lifetime?
Reincarnation is something that I think is one of the very difficult issues to deal with, in part because where I think many of us have had an experience, certainly at least of a temporary glimpse or an altered state. Many people have had transpersonal experiences, Satori, Kensho, Nirvikalpa Samadhi, Sahar Samadhi, but have not had a direct experience of a past life. And so empirical sort of first-person knowledge becomes very, very tricky under these circumstances. A Zen master can demonstrate Satori, on a drop of a dime, but not his or her past lives. Dalai Lama says he can't remember his past lives, but I'm supposed to believe that Shirley MacLaine can. I have trouble with this. So that's just the beginning of the problem. The second is that there's always been a very, very esoteric understanding of reincarnation, which was put by Shankara when he said the Lord is the one and only transmigrant. In other words, there's only one self, the same one self we were talking about earlier, and that's what transmigrates. That's what's reborn in every holon, frankly. But I think that is true, but it does beg the question, which is, okay, but what about my relative soul on its way to enlightenment? Does that puppy transmigrate, and however you want to conceive it? And the traditions are pretty clear that it does. There are very few of them that disagree with that. And it becomes difficult, as I say, because the evidence for it becomes much, much shakier than the evidence for, let's say, Satori. You can go in and put somebody in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. You can hook them up to an EEG machine and get readouts in the brain that something is happening. But you can't put somebody in and say, hook up the EEG machine and say, that's right, you're experiencing yourself, building the pyramids 4,000 years ago.
Or even if they are having that subjective experience, maybe they're very creative.
Very, very tough.
Imagine.
You look at the guy that's done the most empirical research, Ian Stevenson, and I think the title of one of his books is a very appropriate title. He comes up with titles like 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. Because they're still just that. At most, they are suggestive. And it's very hard to prove, for example, some of the evidence is typically that something happened to me when I was 2 years old, and it was appeared to have something to do with a previous life, and only somebody could have known about that information. And then they checked on that information and found out it was true. Now, on the one hand, and that seems to indicate that I was reborn. But on the other hand, whoever had that knowledge, I could have just read their mind with telepathy.
Right.
Once you allow non-physical existence,
right,
it's very hard to narrow down just what version of ghosts you're getting.
Like when they came up with the title GESP or General ESP to talk about all the different types of things, the precognition, or are you directly getting it from someone?
Exactly.
It becomes very hard.
Very hard to pin down.
Charlie tried to spend a good time explaining that. And
right. Charlie's done terrific research in this area, and he'd be the first one to tell you it's just damn hard to pin down once you open up the Pandora's box of that kind of existence. Aurobindo added another kind of twist that I always thought made a certain amount of sense to me anyway, which is that the soul, in order to endure the rigors of transmigration, has itself to be fairly highly evolved. Otherwise, it just dissipates on the shock of the re-entry or whatever.
Well, that would almost be like some of the modern magical theories where they say you don't actually achieve a soul for real until you've done a lot of work and you stabilize it.
Yes, I think that's the general idea of what's coming across here. Theoretically, that makes sense to me. Theoretically, I believe that the soul does transmigrate, that it continues to do so until it has permanent access to causal states. I theoretically believe that the Bardo realm, that the transmigration occurs, is the same as the subtle or dream state. It's classically or traditionally maintained that if you can, for example, permanently access lucid dream state, that you can control your dreaming intentionally, then when you die, it's the same process. You go through a dream state and you can control your rebirth. It's the same process because it's the same state. And if you're conscious during the dying process and remain conscious into the Bardo realm, then you can to some degree select how the rebirth process goes. I think that makes theoretical sense. If you get to the point where you have permanent access to causal or formless state, you have a further choice given you, according to the traditions. You don't have to come back at all. You can simply remain in the formless, nirvanic state and not be reborn. That is clearly the aim of Theravadan tradition, is to get off the circle of samsara entirely. By the time you then add the non-dual traditions, they replace that with the notion of bodhisattva, which is, whether you're enlightened or not, you're coming back. You're coming back to help the rest of us who are still here. All of those make theoretical sense to me. I don't have the kind of empirical evidence for them that I do for Satori, or Nirvikalpa Samadhi, or Sahara Samadhi. But I've had a direct experience of that kind of thing. Many people have had direct experiences of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, whereas very few people have had a direct experience of going to the Bardo realms and being, past lives of 20 and 30 and 40 lifetimes ago.
Other than some of these near-death examples.
Well, and that's fine too. Again, it gets a little dicey in terms of how you're actually interpreting it. The near-death experience to me, though, is not really evidence of reincarnation. It's evidence of these higher states that you can access. And if you actually look at what they're tending to do, it's not very different from accessing Savikalpa Samadhi or Nirvikalpa Samadhi or something. It's a direct experience they're having, and they come back and they tell you about that direct experience. It doesn't prove that they were reborn. The same as having Satori doesn't prove that you were reborn. I'm just saying it's a different type of evidence. It's much, much harder to get the transmigration evidence. So all the things I gave you make theoretical sense to me, but I myself have never experienced a past life. Whereas the other type of evidence I'm mostly working with, Nirvikalpa Samadhi or Sahara Samadhi or Bhava Samadhi, there's direct evidence for that. Many of us have experienced those. We have EEG things showing that something's going on in our brain. Probably just,
You're right, bothering kind of guy.
So theoretically I think it makes sense, but it's real hard to come by evidence for it.
All right, let's move on here. Here's another good question that I would like to ask you. It's from a fellow named Mark Edwards. He asks, why have you only focused on the interior contemplative spiritual practices when many other spiritual traditions, the sacramental traditions, the collective traditions of social service, the behavioral traditions of devotion and hatha yoga, sacramental family life, the artistic spiritual traditions of calligraphy, music, etc., can be so beautifully and easily explained and presented within the collective and behavioral domains of your model? He thinks that the exoteric traditions should get more play with you.
Yeah, I think he's exactly right, and he's himself doing writings that are addressing that lack. And I think from what I've seen, he's doing a very good job of it. One of the things that I tend to focus on are the hard theoretical issues that there aren't a lot of good. I tend to focus on some of the hard theoretical issues that need attention, let's say, the difficult issues. And once I come up with something that at least appears to be a solution, or as a first approximation, then I tend not to be as interested. I tend to move on to the other tough issue.
Sure.
So in this case, what he's talking about, precisely because all those things that Mark mentioned do fit my model.
It's not a big deal for you
It's
to
not
have
a big
to
deal,
struggle
right?
with it.
Because then people can come and they'll see the obviousness as this gentleman has, and then he's gone and he's done terrific work. That's what I hope people will do, is they'll come in and go, got it, got the outline, got the framework,
right.
And then they can go in and do this extraordinary, important work.
Like Enlightenment.com wants to do with transformational techniques on the web.
That's right.
Okay, here's another one. The traditional goal of Eastern religion and esotericism is moksha, freedom from rebirth in the form of samadhi nirvana. Are these types of goals relevant for modern humans? Can they be restated in forms that are consistent with the modern and dominant scientific worldview?
Yeah, I think any time you have a state that offers liberation from life suffering, that it's relevant. And I don't think anybody would want to forego a capacity for great liberation, including somebody in the modern world. The difficulty, of course, is how then do you bring that into the everyday world in a way that has some sort of relevance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where the general notion of the bodhisattva tends to make a great deal of sense, which is namely, you, after thoroughly realizing the formless state of nirvana, bring that realization to bear on every form that arises. And the impulse that accompanies that is something known as compassion. So the driving force becomes, I have been fortunate enough to find some sort of liberation, freedom, and fullness in my own being. How can I communicate that to others in a way that benefits them? And it's not very different than if somebody came along to you and gave you $1 billion. Now, most people's initial impulse is, I'm going to share that with some other people that need it. It's the same thing if you get a really profound awakening experience. It's not, oh, I'm going to get away from the world. It's, oh, somebody gave me $1 billion. I'm going to go out and share it. And that's generally what happens with people that have that kind of realization. They are moved in a very, very profound way to share the wealth. And that's what happens. So the pressing concern right now is something we've talked about a little bit earlier, which is, yes, once you've found the nature of the mind, once you've found nirvana, once you've found this formless, ever-present state, what do you do in the relative realm? And what you do is you try to go in with this as integral approach as possible and start to have an impact on educational system, the political system, the business system, and so on, so that those systems become conducive to states of realization and liberation. Obviously, it's a tall order, but there's no reason not to engage it.
No.
So
it might be the purpose of being here.
Somebody might say that, yeah.
Now we begin the third section of the interview, tracks 12 of this disc through track 3 of the second disc. The conversation turns to criticisms of and challenges to Ken's work. As Ken explains and defends his theory, he passionately urges all of us to wake up to the truths that constantly surround us.
I'd like to get serious now, with your permission, and talk to you about a problem that I've had with respect to you for a long time. And that problem is why it is that more people don't acknowledge the grandeur and beauty and immensity and magnificence of your theoretical system. And it's completely and absolutely obvious to me that you've done a better job of what you set out to do than anyone else ever has. You know, comparisons, I don't know about comparisons to Hegel and Kant, but certainly to William James seem to me to be totally appropriate at this point. You know, your marriage of science and mysticism, bringing together Western developmental psychology and Eastern spirituality, your ability to bring so many, many theorists into rough alignment through the orienting generalizations, and your fantastic organizational skills, it's all unsurpassed. So what I'd like to know is, given that, why is it that so many people, it's not that just people end up getting pissed off at you, it's that more people aren't willing to read and acknowledge, or, I'll point out your work to them, and I've been reading you since 1981, and go, this is totally amazing. He's blown my mind completely at least 3 separate times, starting at the first time when I read The Holographic Paradigm and was staring at a washing machine when I was in college, and I was watching it go back and forth and thinking of the glycerin and the whole thing. And so in order to kind of get at this, and I have a suspicion, what I'd like to do is go through some of the criticisms that have been made towards you. And obviously I'm doing it as a friend and not as as an enemy. The first one that comes up is that, we talked about this before, the difficulty of your work. It's all over, it keeps changing, you seem to agree with everybody who comes along, and you find a way of integrating them in. And I think that's a bogus, objection. I mean, read the works. It's like read the fucking manual and computer stuff. Read it, see it. It keeps getting better and more comprehensive. It must irk you a little bit, though, that people sort of don't get it.
Well, before I respond to that, let me get the first part out of the way and say there might be a couple of correct reasons that people are put off. A lot of what I'm saying could be wrong. And we have to acknowledge it. A lot of what I'm saying could be wrong. And people look at it and go, no, wrong, no, wrong, just wrong. And that's so that I could be wrong, and that's why they're not responding to it. Second item, of course, is that some people, at least on 3 books out of 20 books, there were some footnotes that were polemical, and some people have objected to those. I think that's a red herring myself, but I think it has to be acknowledged that made it difficult for some people to get into the argument because they were put off by this aspect in 3 of these books. That said, then, I would go to reasons on my favor of why I believe some people have trouble with it. And obviously these are self-serving reasons. I mean, I've given the others, reasons on the other side. Now I'll try to give some reasons in defense of myself. And the first that I've found is that if I just look at the people that respond to my work versus those that don't, there's a general pattern. The people that respond to my work are those that have read just about as much as I have. In other words, they know what's out there, and they're very familiar with a large number of the things that I'm bringing together. And so they realize the importance of including all these various types of approaches and systems and ideas and try to bring them, under one umbrella.
But you're providing a better map than anybody else.
That kind of thing. But it's people like Mike Murphy, who himself, has done comparable kind of stuff. Someone like that will look at it and just get every single sentence from beginning to end. I mean, he just completely groks the whole thing and then adds stuff to it along the way. Most of the criticism I get come from people that I think haven't done enough homework to realize why some of these things need to be included. The amount of research, for example, on the developmental aspects of the psyche cross-culturally, an enormous amount of research on that. Most of it tends to be just tossed out by people. And I have a general rule which gets into the second problem with why people have difficulty with my work, which is my general rule is everybody's right. And so I have a very different approach to bringing together different philosophies and different psychologies, which is that every single system ever offered has some degree of truth in it. As I sometimes put it, no mind can produce 100% error. Mm-hmm. Therefore, unfortunately, most of my contemporaries approach philosophy in this fashion. I've got a particular idea, and everybody else is wrong.
Right, it's either or. Period.
Yeah, basically that's the approach. I don't think. I think everybody is right. Even the materialists and the reductionists, and they have very important things that need to be included. So I ask more a meta question, which is what system or pattern can honor the most number of truths from the most number of disciplines.
So you never met a question you didn't like.
Just like Will Rogers. And that's absolutely the truth. So people find, behaviorism to Marxism to atomism. I mean, there's some parts of all of that I try to, in a very loose sense, based on orienting generalizations, say, let's just skip all the details right now. Generally speaking, these people are right about this general thing. Let's just make room for that. Let's just put that over here, and then the Buddhists, they're right. Let's put that over here, and then the physicists, okay, put them over here. And once you do that, you get this sort of composite map. And clearly nobody wants to confuse the map with the territory, but just as well, you don't want a fucked up incomplete map.
You want the best map you can get.
Right, which is what most people give you. So unfortunately, it therefore takes a lot of reading, a lot of homework to be able to relate to what I'm doing. People have to see the importance of honoring every known truth. If they don't have that impulse, they'll settle for a lesser partial truth because it's easier on them. It's not hard. They just say, well, I'm a Buddhist and everybody else is wrong, and that's the way it is. Or I don't know about everybody else, but I'm not going to get into it with them. And so I understand that impulse, but it's not the impulse behind my work. Mm-hmm. The third thing I would say in my self-serving defense is that the research pretty clearly indicates that you have to be at second tier before these problems will even exist for you. Blue and orange and green aren't interested in integral comprehensive maps. That doesn't make sense to them. But something very dramatic happens when people move into second tier, to yellow and turquoise. All of a sudden, big pictures are the only things that satisfy. Because there's a comprehensiveness, there's a fullness, there's a drive to integrate and to honor and to include all these various approaches and systems and truths.
Or once you've left the farm and seen these other things, you can't
go back. No. But again, run the demographics. Less than 2% of the population's at second tier. I've always been writing for those people. That's not a big audience, relatively speaking. So those are my three self-serving reasons for it. I would have to say though that I've been really gratified how in the last particularly the last 5 years this stuff has caught on. And now, the books are now, they sort of blow my own horn, they're now in close to 34 languages.
All right.
We just went into Slovenian, Slovakian, Estonian, Latvian, Serbian. Apparently they're reading now that they've stopped raping and killing. Slovakian, Serbian, Bulgarian. So with 20 books and up to 34 languages, I'm the most translated academic writer in America.
And you're kind of cute, too.
It's kind of cute, yeah.
No, you are.
Yeah, that's kind of fun. And it's, we've got sitting president and sitting vice presidents endorse this work. I mean, it's come a long way. It's really come a long way. Okay. And I see it sort of, the signs of it increasing are really happening quite rapidly, actually.
Let me ask you let me get to sort of my critiques of you that I have lined up, and we'll just get rid of them. We talked about the difficulty of your work. We talked about, some people experience you as arrogant, but they're doing this whole projection thing mainly, and, they're saying, if you yourself admit you're not fully enlightened, how can you be writing about enlightenment and that sort of thing? But I think that's pretty much a red herring, so let's just go past that. One more thing about the polemical style is that I don't know if the 3 books and the footnotes you're counting the second to last page of One Taste, which I once asked you about.
That's right. You don't like that. I changed that in the second edition.
Yeah, I just thought it was, harsh to say all these. You did?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, never mind that. Okay, now I want to get to the ones that really interest me.
But I'd like to point that, there was a...
Well, what you were saying was, if you're running with the wolves or doing men's groups or doing whatever, if it's not true in deep dreamless sleep and every place else, then it's not real.
Now,
I thought that was harsh.
Okay, let's... Now you've done it. So let's just pause. Let me reflect on that just briefly.
Here's where we're going to get interested.
Remember, I was doing just what we've been talking about earlier, though. I was trying to point out the difference between the two truths, the relative truth and the ultimate truth. And what I was saying, made very clear throughout that whole book, is that all of these things are fine in the relative realm, including integral transformative practice, weightlifting, running with wolves, any of these things.
Going to the movies, as you talk about
Going
yourself.
to the movies. These are all completely valid on the relative realm. But I wanted to end with a reminder of absolute, or the non-dual realm. And I used a quote from Ramana Maharshi to remind you, because when I first heard it, it became a koan that for 6 months I was in ceaseless meditation on until it sort of popped open for me. And that is, if it's not present in deep dreamless sleep, it is not real. Now that is it's shocking, because there's only one thing present in deep dreamless sleep, and that's formless consciousness, yes, the self, transcendental self. And until you can remain subtly conscious through the waking, dream, and deep sleep state and realize that ever-present self, then you don't have ultimate, quote, unquote, non-dual realization. So I wanted to end one case with that reminder that do all those other things, but don't forget the ultimate truth as well. Something is present with you through all changes of state, through waking, dream, and deep sleep state. And you must awaken to that realization of that ever-present witness that is right now aware of everything that's arising moment to moment. And until that happens, everything else is okay, but it's relative and it's passing, and it's not going to affect ultimate liberation. And that's what I was doing.
And that's right, but what I think happens is that people look at what you've written and they kind of idolize you and they see that you're into deep meditation and non-dual awareness and they know they're not doing that and they end up feeling bad about themselves.
Good.
Even though you say everything is...
No, that's exactly what's supposed to happen. Ramana Maharshi kicked me in the butt and he said, Wilbur, if you don't have at least some understanding of this, you should feel bad about yourself. And I said, okay, sir, and I worked on it until I had at least a little glimmer of that understanding. You can't make people feel totally good about themselves and still spur them to try to have a realization.
That would have been idiot compassion in your...
In a sense, yes. Now, what I did do, because I was a little surprised when you brought that up, but anytime somebody brings up a section and says, this is mean-spirited, or this is unfair, or I don't like it, go back and do it. So I went back for the revised edition and wrote several sentences in trying to indicate what we're talking about, to sort of soften that section. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah, well.
All right, let's move on to a few philosophers. John Stuart Mill said that he would rather be Socrates dissatisfied than a swine satisfied.
Yes. And
the way he knew that that was true is that he asked people who had both experience, people who had debauched lives, and also people who studied, the same person who then studied philosophy. In your case, my belief is that you haven't studied, for example, full-on nature mysticism. You haven't experienced it. From what I've read. Let me finish here.
Right.
And that what happens is that once we get to the transrational levels, and you talk about nature mysticism, then deity mysticism, then formless, and then non-dual, how can you know that you're not merely projecting what you've studied and the people who you're most enamored in, and then you've ended up producing this wonderful theory that once we get to the higher state says it's this way, this way, this way, when, I'm pretty sure that they haven't and you haven't, I mean, how do we know that the highest beings on this planet aren't, some wild shaman somewhere now or in the past who have done stuff we just don't have any idea of, and that their, ultimate states are just so, or maybe that maybe it's still not hierarchical, maybe they're just incommensurable, maybe they just don't line up. And how do you know that the non-dual meditative thing isn't just your projection here? How could you know?
See, I have several funny lines that I'm not going to give because they won't translate very well to print. I'll try to just give us a straight answer. Although I'm chortling inside, I'm so humorous to myself here. It's a very good question, and that's exactly right. And let me be the first to say that based on what I try to do in my writing is present evidence. And if there isn't evidence for something, then I try to shy away from it. I think that's why. Even when I went back and was editing the collected works, about 95% of everything I've written I still stand by, because it was based on evidence at the time, and the evidence still holds up. What I found that what happened in my writings is I would just continue to expand it into other areas that I hadn't dealt with. But even the earlier books are very, very solid because it's based on a certain type of evidence and a certain. I try to be very careful about following the evidence, phenomenological, scientific, or spiritual experiences.
Sure, you're an empiricist, whether it's in the physical world or it's intersubjective hermeneutical verification.
As long as we use that in the sense of immediate experience and awareness, and not in the sense of sensory awareness.
You're a scientist, Ken. It has to do with subjectivity, but you are a scientist.
Yes, also hopefully art, morals, and science, and hopefully I'm all big three. I'm hoping not to get pigeonholed as a positivist, which Jorge Ferrer does to me, so I'm not going to let you get away with that. But we do try to look for evidence, definitely. And in this case, the general, there are several lines of argument. One of the most classic used by the traditions is the so-called Chinese box, which is if one state has access to the other state, but not vice versa, then you're probably dealing with a higher state. The three great states that all human beings have access to are waking, dream, and deep sleep. Generally speaking, those are also called gross, subtle, and causal. When consciousness has an expansion in any of those states, you get a different type of mystical feeling. In the gross realm, which is held to be the lowest ontological realm, the gross realm is that which is defined by sensory perception. And frankly, it includes nature and Gaia and anything you can see in the waking state, generally speaking, based on the sensory-motor perception. An expansion in the gross realm produces what we call nature mysticism, and it's an expansion with the entire sensory-motor world, moment to moment. That's a very high state. As you know, in my own system, it's like 10 levels, it's number 7 or so. Mm-hmm. It's what Plotinus called the world soul.
Right.
Most of the people that acknowledge that have 2 or 3 higher states, including Aurobindo and including Plotinus, including most of the traditions. And they arrive at it being a higher state because once you have had an experience of the gross realm and being one with the gross realm in nature mysticism, when you then enter the dream realm during sleep, for example, or in Savikalpa Samadhi, the gross realm is suspended. So in the dream state, there is no Gaia, there is no physical, empirical nature, material world. You're instead in a world of luminosities and images, non-material images. And this dream state is held to be, if you then have an expansion of consciousness in the subtle, then you experience generally something known as deity mysticism, which is a oneness with beings that are not merely in the physical realm. Now that being can include the oversoul itself. It can include yidams. It can be becoming, one with Christ or angels, or yourself becoming a Dhyani Buddha, Sambhogakaya realization, for example. And what tends to happen under those circumstances is you also start lucid dreaming. So you have access to both the waking state and the dream state in consciousness. If consciousness continues to grow into the deep sleep or formless realm, then that experience is there's no gross realm present. There's no nature, no Gaia, nor is there any subtle realm present. There are no deities, no angels, no luminosities, no nothing. There is only causal formlessness, vast, unbounded consciousness as such, without an object. That's held to be a higher state because, generally speaking, they unfold in a way such that you can experience subtle states without experiencing causal permanence, but not vice versa. So in other words, if I'm permanently installed in causal witness, then by definition, I'm witnessing everything that's arising constantly. I'm aware of the gross realm of nature mysticism when it arises. In the dream state, when nature disappears, I am now witnessing the subtle realm. And then in the causal realm, I remain as the witness when no objects arise. But I can't have an experience of just the gross realm. In other words, be just a nature mystic. I can have that experience without being able to experience these other states, but not vice versa. Therefore, these other states are higher because they transcend and include a lesser state. So that's one way you establish that causalness.
You're saying it is pretty well empirically noted that it goes this way and not the other way.
It's not only empirically noted; it's kind of it's almost logical too. I mean, you can just sort of deduce it. As I say, for example, you can have access to subtle states without having access to permanent causal witnessing, but not vice versa. If you're permanent causal witnessing, you have access to subtle states by definition and by the fact that you're witnessing everything that's arising, including all the subtle states.
And the only way for people to know that what you're saying is really true is to
experience it.
Right.
That's correct. So what you try to do is give kind of the argument of the Chinese boxes, saying that, look, experience shows us this, number one, and number two, there's a logical coherence about it. Even though these states themselves transcend logic, the fact is you can achieve one without the other, but not vice versa, and that not vice versa constitutes a hierarchy of unfolding. And the traditions certainly generally maintain in terms of Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, Dharmakaya, gross, subtle, causal. And I happen to believe that evidence supports that. There are other types of states that don't show that progression. And they're just equivalent states as far as we can tell. And generally what happens is in the subtle realm, for example, you can have all sorts of different types of subtle experiences. None of them seem to be particularly higher or lower, and you can have some without others, and there's no stage conception. Not everything occurs in stages. I say roughly in my own model about 1 out of 3. Stage conceptions covers about 1/3 of what's going on, but they're almost always left out because people don't want stages hem them in, and nobody wants to be hemmed in, so they just toss all that stuff out. So do a little boomeritis kind of thing going there. Yeah. But a lot of stuff doesn't occur in stages, and it's certainly true with various types of waking state mysticism or nature mysticism. All sorts of variations occur there. The shamanic state actually tends to move from nature into subtle. It does have some subtle Sambhogakaya mysticism going on, particularly when you have journeys to the upper world and underworld. Even though they do tend to have kind of a nature imprint, in many cases they're getting much more into subtle luminosities, and even Kundalini experiences tend to happen. But the formless state tends to be not often understood in shamanism. And any religious experience is not understood very well in shamanism. And then I make a classic distinction, which is unless you've gone through the causal unmanifest, you can't really have a true non-dual state, because the actual non-dual state is the union of pure emptiness with all form. And if you haven't accessed the pure causal formlessness, then you can't have a genuine non-duality where that formlessness is then one with all form that's arising moment to moment. A lot of people take nature mysticism and call that non-dual, and it's not, because it leaves out subtle causal and therefore non-dual states.
Got it.
So,
thank you. All right, next philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. You're familiar with the concept of the Ouroboros, the snake turning around and swallowing its own tail. My question is, suppose that the leap from rational to trans-rational consciousness is one that can only be made in a complete letting go, so that when it's time to evolve into trans-rational consciousness, you have to, in order to really let go of yourself, you have to really let go of everything, and you have to be willing to experience chaos. You have to be willing to experience, you have to be willing to go through the dark night of the soul, through almost kind of a Dionysian energy. Your system seems to promise almost sort of an orderly, evolutionary transition that will be just, plain and simple, but the reality is that, I think, that's not how it happens for most people.
Right.
Unless you're in a contemplative or spiritual tradition. A lot of people go through really wild stuff before they get established at a higher stage.
I think all the time, actually.
Does the question make sense?
Sure. Yeah, but
so that you're saying it's this nice, simple, logical progression,
no.
and actually to get from rational to trans-rational, you have to be completely willing to let go of rational.
Oh, of course.
Which is very scary to do, and the rational mind doesn't want to do that.
No. Look, you're entirely correct. What I do, and I've often called it, I'm giving when I lay out the stages of development, I'm giving what I explicitly called in SES a rational reconstruction of the trans-rational. Now, that's a very specific thing. It does not say that this rational reconstruction will get you to the trans-rational. It's not instead of it. It does not try to replace it. It just says, look, we can say a few things about these higher states. We're not completely mute on the topic. After all, the mystics have been talking about them for millennia. But it's entirely different to say, look, there's gross and there's subtle and there's causal states. It doesn't mean that people progress through them in that simple 1, 2, 3 fashion. And in fact, what actually happens is that it's turbulent and it's extremely chaotic. And in terms of letting go of everything, absolutely letting go of everything. But it's not, on the one hand, it's very hard. On the other hand, it's not hard at all, because everybody does it once every 24 hours. They pass from the dream state into deep dreamless sleep. And they completely let go of everything. There is no rationality, there is no suffering, there is no pain, there is no self, there is no non-self. Everybody is plunged in that formless realm every night for hours on end. And they're plunged into that real self on that basis. So everybody knows how to die. You do it every night. You let go of your ego, you let go of your body, you completely let go of it every single night, many
right,
nights.
And you don't get freaked out that you're going to sleep.
No. So what happens, though, if you became conscious of that process, then there's a little freaky out part that goes along with it. And that's what the traditions are for generally, and that's what a good master is there, kind of hold your hand, because frankly, if you do it in consciousness, it's totally freaky and totally chaotic and scary as hell. But the simple fact that I kind of laid out some of these broad milestones doesn't mean that that actually is how it actually occurs when you go through them. The same if we have a map that says here's Boulder and there's Denver. You know, it's, but, you know, and then...
Yeah, I had that last night. You can't get to 93 from 270.
So some of these things are laid out in a simple way, but that's not the way the path goes, and it's always very, very difficult. Particularly the non-dual and higher ones are difficult because they're so simple. That they're much, much simpler than most people can grasp. And therefore it takes a very, very, very long time to see what is literally 100% in front of your eyes right now. And it's so fucking obvious that it takes most people about 2 decades to see it and believe it. And that's what Dzogchen has mostly, probably the most effective. I think his snoring probably is not going to help the digital equipment. Either stop snoring or you're going to go out, buddy. Let's see what happens.
All right.
See. Anyway, it's not just that people die each night completely as they pass into the formless. It's that formless state is their ever-present awareness moment to moment. There's something in you right now that without any effort whatsoever is noticing everything that's arising. You notice the birds, you hear my voice, everything is noticed. There's something in you that is conscious of everything moment to moment.
And it's the same.
It's the same.
And you.
It's the same in me. It's the consciousness is the singular, which the plural is unknown.
Whether in the dog or not is unclear.
We assume so. We assume it's right down into little quirks. But what happens is that people have something else that's called attention. It's a contraction in the field of that ever-present noticing. And that attention is your identity. So instead of resting in that noticing space that notices everything that's arising, and that is your original face, the face you had before your parents were born, instead of resting in that condition, we contract into attention, and then we follow on objects that pass by this noticing. And so our life is a string of putting together objects in a way that we can wring as much pleasure as we can from each one as we kind of hook them together. So, whereas the only bliss comes from the witness itself, not from any of the objects that we sort of grab at. So each night people get kind of refreshed by letting go of objects and resting in this infinite self. But that self remains as the ever-present noticing on their day-to-day basis. And what meditation is, basically, for these non-dual traditions, is a way of stilling these objects until you notice the fact that you're always noticing. Till you simply start to rest in that ever-present witness, which itself cannot be seen or heard or tasted. Right. This is vast seer. And becoming comfortable by letting go of objects moment to moment. And that's the tricky part, because that's the dying part, and that's where it gets very, very wacky for several years, usually, until it's done. And then it's just completely, rather pathetically obvious. But that's not a...
Once you get it.
Yeah.
But only you can get it. Only each individual can get it.
Yeah.
Which brings us to Hermann Hesse.
That's what I thought.
I knew you'd think that. In the glass bead game, otherwise known as Magister Ludi, 1946, Nobel Prize for Literature, he wrote, this is the music master.
I'm sorry?
Oh, no, nothing. This is the music master speaking. I don't know if you've read the book.
A long time ago.
I hadn't, and I've started because people told me that it relates to enlightenment.com. He wrote that, to be candid, I myself, for example, have never in my life said a word to my pupils about the meaning of music. If there is one, it does not need my explanations. On the other hand, I have always made a great point of having my pupils count their eighths and sixteenths nicely. Whatever you become, teacher, scholar, or musician, have respect for the meaning, but do not imagine that it can be taught. The task of the teacher and scholar is to study means, cultivate tradition, and preserve the purity of methods, not to deal in incommunicable experiences which are reserved to the elect, who often enough pay a high price for this privilege. So the phrase that struck me was the notion of not imagining that the meaning can be taught. And the real reason I think people get pissed off at you is that your work does not carry an inherent moral injunction in it. It does not tell them how to live their life. It goes back to you saying very carefully that you are not a guru, you are a pandit. You are a scholar and you are a teacher now, but not a teacher as a guru. And so people are reading your work, and they don't feel as excited and compelled as they think they should feel if somebody's really figured out as much as you figured out. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a moral injunction other than evolve, or maybe practice an all quadrants, all level approach. But they don't feel inspired, or they don't see kind of an archetypal world vision the way I imagine people think they would have felt reading Hegel.
Yeah.
And and that's because you can't teach them the meaning. The real meaning of spirituality isn't something you would ever claim you knew and would teach them, because you're not that kind of a guy. That's not what you do, and you've never made the claim that that's what you're doing.
Right.
But yet, because you have put out a better, more comprehensive system than anybody else has, they think that the better your system becomes, the more they expect to find it in there, whether or not you've ever tried to set it out. And I think it drives them kind of crazy. And that's why they're assuming if you're really who you seem to be and have done what you seem to be done, then they would read your work and get inspired in a different kind of way. Now, I myself, when I've read some of your poetry, I actually like your poetry. I've gone blissing out into some altered states, really struggling with the notion of the witness, or even when we were talking before, for a short period of time, I, uncontracted my contraction of consciousness, and I was, maybe getting it a little bit. But that's kind of a personal interactive thing, and I'm lucky enough to know you and be here. But when people read your work, I keep making this point again, but, whatever you become, teacher, scholar, and musician, have respect for the meaning, but do not imagine that it can be taught. Yeah. Well, you teach people to count their eighths and their sixteenths very nicely. You are really good around scientific method and showing what you're doing, and about being empirical, and about showing people where they're leaving stuff out. You do that stuff, fabulously. I mean, I think you're right on with Hesse here, but that thing about teaching the meaning, it's there because it's everywhere, and that's what you're pointing out. But they want it, I don't know, spoon-fed or something like that.
It's a tough one. I certainly hear what you're saying, and it's, again, also, it's one of those areas that, of course, you can't win. If I actually did what they were saying, people would say, he's trying to control the meaning and shove it down my throat. Mm-hmm. So if I actually succeeded in doing it, I would get criticized, and if I don't do it, I get criticized. And I think because what happens is something, in a sense, what you're talking about. What you can basically do with any of these, and ultimately all of this work is just really comes down to pointing out instructions. What we were doing, pointing out the witness, pointing out the non-dual state, because these are things that are ever present in people, and it doesn't take any development to have an access to that, because it's something that's completely 100% ever present. And it's not a change of state. It's that which observes changes of state. So, on the one hand, when people kind of read my work, there isn't a person that will get very excited about it, because it does tend to carry a kind of imperative, which is to somehow start applying this. And in that sense, the moral injunction is, in the relative realm, the moral injunction is to, the best you can, be all quadrant, all level, all line, just because that's a more comprehensive mode of understanding in the world, and it has the less marginalizing tendency than any other system, because it tries to embrace all known truths in a friendly way and say all of these truths are important.
And you're even okay with translative and not transformational.
And in a sense, that's fine. It's if you're going to translate the world, do your best to do it in as comprehensive and inclusive a fashion as possible. That's the relative injunction. The ultimate injunction is wake up. And so what I generally do is alternate these in the writing. And what you call the poetry is, when I particularly started this with SES, and I've done it in almost every book since, is I'll give sort of some of this elaborate, all quadrants, all levels, all lines, but at some point I'll say, okay, now forget all of that. I mean, and what's aware of all of that? And there are pointing out instructions for the witness and the non-dual or saha state in almost all of these books. So what I'm trying to do under the circumstances is cover the bases, if you will. Trying to say, look, the real thing here is you need to wake up and to your original face and your real self. And then you need to translate that into the real world in as comprehensive and inclusive a fashion as you can. Because even though realization itself is formless and ever present, you don't want to translate that formless realization into some narrow, petty, small philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And many people do that.
Or an obsession of any kind.
They do. And it's unfortunate because it's not a healthy way to express realization. And so I find even teachers that have a wonderfully strong, powerful realization often don't have a very integral philosophy to embrace it. And they end up supporting some really rather narrow, petty ideas.
Right.
And it's not through mean-spirited or anything like that at all. But formless realization doesn't carry information about the world of form. That's why the person said that, what do I know how to do that Buddha doesn't? And I said, drive a sheep. And it wasn't just a throwaway line. The point is there are truths in the manifest realm that you have, even if you're awakened to nirvana, samsara evolves and changes. And you have to take your nirvanic understanding into the world of samsara in a more comprehensive and up-to-date fashion. And so even for a Buddhist, there's nothing in Buddhist treatises on kidney transplants or computers or automobiles. Nirvana has to be adapted to the changing circumstances of samsara. It has to be expressed through that. So I have two injunctions. One is wake up to nirvana. Two, express it in an integral samsaric philosophy. Because otherwise you're going to dent your realization. You're going to squish it. You're going to not honor it. You're going to narrow it down into some very small, often petty philosophy that doesn't take account of the riches of the manifest realm. So it's hard to get a crusade going under these circumstances because it is kind of, it's a very broad stroke. So that's why I tend to try to alternate as well. And a lot of the poetic sections are where people get, most fired up in terms of their own realization. Mm-hmm. But the other stuff is just hard work. The all quadrants, all levels, it's just flat out hard work.
The other piece of this is that you better than anyone perhaps have championed the inner realms, your left side, subjectivity, the interior dimensions. Although you've fought like hell to bring it back to legitimate discourse, the very act of producing a logical system of the magnitude and beauty of your system, for some people, ends up kind of taking the mystical, interior, sparkly, magical, chaotic, divine nature right out of it. Somehow for them, your logic sucks the mystery and beauty right out of reality. It's almost as if the Apollonian cancels out the Dionysian, and I don't think there's a way you can win on that. And it's not your fault.
No, I understand. No, but
it puts them off. Because they go, hey, he's not got like this radiant, luminous, it's all there, obviously you do, but they don't read it and get excited the way they do, authors whose names we won't mention, who write stuff that is, not even close.
Well, what would probably change a little bit on that? Well, first of all, if that's all that I did, or if I actually thought that these rational reconstruction of the transrational was a be-all and end-all in itself, then these people would be completely right. Logic does suck the life out of any of the transrational realms. And so, obviously, you don't want to do that. But at the same time, you don't want to just ignore, oppress, marginalize rationality and logical analysis. That's also an important part of manifestation. So what you want to do basically is have an integral approach that includes all of those aspects. And if you take, one of the things that we're going to do, for example, I think people are going through it now, if you just take the poetic pointing out instructions from my books and you just put those all together in one volume, then there's no quadrants, there's no levels, there's no lines, there's no development, there's none of that. Mm-hmm. They're just pointing to this ever-present awareness that you are and that you have been eternally, and in how you can actually awaken that, realize that, and have that manifest throughout your life. And if you just read those sections, then it's entirely different. Then it's nothing but Dionysian sort of ecstasy, basically. There's no logic, there's no stages or realms or any of that kind of stuff.
It's just like reading Grace and Grit. It's a totally different part of who you are.
Yeah, exactly. But part of what you want to do at some point is, if you're trying to make room in the conventional realm for any sort of dharma or any form of transrational awareness, and since rational professors, so to speak, take all of that as being completely hallucinatory nonsense, then somebody has to go in and sort of have it out with these guys on the rational level and say, look, there's abundant reason to acknowledge these higher transrational states. But of course I have to be rational to do that part of the argument, and that's what I do. And I say, okay, fine, we'll do Derrida, we'll do Foucault, and we'll do Heidegger, and then we'll do Russell, and whatever game you want to play. And when you've done all of that, you'll see that it doesn't exhaust reality. Something else is going on here. There are transrational states and stages of which we have an extraordinary amount of evidence. And by cutting yourself off from that, you are cutting yourself off from your real nature. Now, somebody has to do it. It's an ugly job. I've decided to step in and do my best on that part. But it doesn't mean that I think that's the only thing you have to do. And frankly, it's hard. I'll be glad when I don't have to do that anymore. It sucks. I just want to write mindless poetry and bad novels. And I can too.
Yes, I know.
I can write as bad a novel as the next guy.
Please enjoy this final section of the interview and future offerings from Enlightenment.com. I'd like to leave you with one last introductory comment. Here, Ken discusses the personal side of what it's like to be Ken Wilber. He also shares his views on such subjects as the Internet, parapsychology, and even the use of psychedelics. Most importantly, Ken always reminds us of the need to find a personal practice and stick with it.
Well, that's a nice segue here for me to ask you just a few personal questions that I wanted to ask you. The first was, why you? Since we were talking about it, comparisons to Hegel, the Einstein of consciousness, even if they're only half right, how do you feel about the fact that, you're the world's most influential and popular psycho-spiritual theorist? How does it feel to have so many people reading, absorbing your words? I mean, is it heady? Do you just think of yourself kind of like as a normal guy with a dog that snores, or is it hard not to get inflated?
Yeah. It's one of those things I tend to think about it. It's like people that have kind of an overnight success. I mean, it's one thing if you're like a rock band and you're together for a week, and then you have a hit single, and then the next day you're on the cover of Time magazine or something. And that must be very unbalancing. Mm-hmm. But most of the bands, like the Beatles or something, they were out there, people for like 10 years, day in and day out. And so I, wrote my first book when I was 23. And I went through a period of, I think, kind of inflation and unbalance because you hear so many projections are put on you that you both demonic, I'm much more demonic, that some people would think that I am. And also, very positive projections put on you. And what tends to happen is that some way, sooner or later, you really have to address that. And I don't think I was particularly fast learned in that regard. But I had such a long time. I've had 30 years, basically. And so even somebody that's kind of slow like me on that area, I'm pretty okay with it after.
Or it wasn't like all of a sudden you had $50 million overnight. And
Exactly.
And you went through some.
Just all of a sudden woke up one day and people started saying this out of the blue.
And you went through some heavy shit with Treya.
And some heavy stuff with Treya, which was very, very, it's radically 100% humbling. Because you just, death is the great leveler. I mean, you lose face, you lose everything, and you can't control it, and it will win. And you will, find out a way to let go and relate to that in a very direct, simple way, or you just get absolutely crushed by it. And I were, semi-insane in 1985, what I call hell year, and I wrote about it very, I think, honestly, in Grace and Grit. That whole chapter in Tahoe. I mean, it's horrifying.
That's the first book I gave to someone. I want to give them to you.
Yeah.
Because they want to know you're real and you're human.
So mostly I don't. If you had some way that you could tape record my inner dialogue,
right?
None of those words that you use would ever find me saying to myself. You would never find, he's the Hegel of this, or he's the great this, or he's the world's most influential. You would find none of that in my interior dialogue. That it's not crossed my.
You're just trying to do a good job at what you do.
And my dog snores.
And your dog does snore.
Yeah.
We have proof.
Right.
So, and how about the fame?
What it does do, the one thing I would say is the sort of, if there's a particular type of burden with it, the type of burden that I've always felt, and that I think is extremely important to feel, is a responsibility to present the truth as best you can. Mm-hmm. And that means based on as much evidence from as many different sources as you possibly can. And it's something that you want to be able to go back and read 10 or 15 or 20 years later and say, I still think that's pretty true. And I feel that because a lot of people look to my work for ways it's going to really they're going to incorporate it in their lives.
Absolutely.
And I want to make sure that I'm not going to disappoint them by leading them down a road for which there is simply no reason, no rhyme, or no evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is a kind of, if I feel sort of any, quote, burden, it's that. But I think it's a burden that everybody in this field should feel. I think it's sort of your, in the best sense of the word, a kind of internal conscience as a compass that makes you be responsible for what you write. So that part is, I feel that, and I think I should. It's very important.
So in a way, you are moving from pundit to teacher, guru, just a little bit, because you know
a pandit's a teacher.
Okay.
Great pandits were, Nagarjuna was a pandit, Plotinus was a pandit. It's a little bit different in terms of what you're communicating and how you communicate it.
You know that people ride on your words. I mean, they eagerly, read the latest Ken interview and they go, aha, and it changes them. I mean,
right.
It's a burden. It's an office. And you're Ken Wilber. I know that seems weird for me to say to you, but hey, you're actually Ken Wilber. The same thing. Yeah. I know that you used to have problems with things like stalking, and we can take this off the tape if you don't want me to talk about it.
It's okay. I still have it.
Does that still go on?
It's a real problem.
Women wanting to have your babies from
men and women, different types, and and both positive and negative. The women are almost always positive. The men are sort of half and half. Half of the men that stalk me are very angry, and half are, I think I'm God, and we're having secret communications with each other. And usually what happens, and so they'll simply come from around the world, across the country, and just show up on the front porch, and they think that I'll know when they're here, and I can just instantly feel them when they're around. Because
I got a question from somebody who I won't say I was, and he wanted me to communicate it to you, and he was talking about how we're all elder brothers, and this was the opportunity for him finally, and I'm thinking,
be careful. Exactly. And the standard joke I make about it, there's the men basically, one way or another, do drive-by shootings. Right. It's a one-time thing. If they're mad at me, they leave the bomb threat, right, and then they get tired and they go away. Or if they think that there's some great communication, they'll try to get it across, and if I don't respond, they'll go away. And the reason is that men can't commit. Women, on the other hand, the little relationship lovers, stalk me for decades, and they're just always there. Most of them are very, very pleasant people, and we kind of have a standing. Some of them become very fun. You can't have any contact with any of them. But one of ours, I don't want to give too much information. One leaves about 3 20-minute messages a day on an answering machine, and has been doing so for 17 years.
No.
Never met any of these people. You can't have any response. But most of them are very sweet. It's very touching. But unfortunately, a lot of them is sort of like the David Letterman incident, and we have to call the police, and they have to come and get them, and they have to, it's very, very unfortunate. It's very, very difficult. And what I really don't want to have to do is put up a fence around the house, but I really think I'm going to have to. It's just getting much worse.
Yeah, that'd be too bad. So Ken, what do you love most about what you do? People wanted to know that. They wanted to know what makes Ken Wilber happy on a day-to-day basis.
Well, a couple things. One is there is an analogy I kind of use is like a guitar. And there's the strings on the guitar, and then there's the box behind it that gives resonance to it. And whenever you awaken your own soul or spirit, that's like strumming the strings. That's the actual where the sound comes from. But there's a great, and that's where that's the ultimate sort of bliss and reward and awareness and understanding and truth and goodness comes when you strike those strings. But there's another kind of satisfaction comes from having the box on the guitar resonate and give depth and expression to the sound from the strings. And what my writing does for me is, after I strike these higher chords through my own spiritual practice, my writing is the box behind it that can give it a resonance. It can flesh it out. It can give it a manifest form that makes the sound even richer, or even deeper. Even though the sound still comes from the strings, it still comes from the soul and spirit. The mind can be the box on the guitar and can give an expression to it It's very, very fulfilling in that sense. So I'm not trying to think my way into spirit. I made that very, very clear from the beginning. You have to do spiritual practice to get to the transrational. You cannot use the rational to get to the transrational. The spiritual practice gets you to the transrational. But then you can give a rational expression to it. You can also express it in dance or painting or poetry as well, and that's very important. But you can also do it, you can give a rational expression to it. And I continue to find that even as I say with enlightened teachers, they benefit from this kind of philosophy because it gives them a bigger box for their guitar. So that the strings, when they strike them, there's some little bitty non-integral box behind the string. And I've continually been struck by how even really, great realized teachers need an integral philosophy to be the box to express the music of their soul and spirit. Because it does come with a territory. It does not come with a territory. You have to do the work to understand all quadrants, all levels, all lines, and so on. And so what I enjoy doing is giving that kind of form to it, because it allows a more comprehensive expression of spiritual understanding. So that part I like. The other part is it makes a difference in people's lives, and that's important.
When you're writing, though, on a day-to-day basis, do you have flow states the way Csikszentmihalyi talks about them? Do you disappear into kind of an altered work state? What John Lilly called it, I think, something like your working day satori. I mean, you go places like that.
Yeah.
I mean, you love the actual work of the writing and the research.
I'm very ambivalent about the actual process because it's physically very painful, because I get in fact, I think pretty weird states. I process information at a very, very spooky rate. Most of the books I've written, a lot of people know, it's only a couple weeks to write each of these books. And it never takes longer than about 3 weeks to write these books. And they generally are fully formed by the time I sit down to write them. And then the actual writing process is uncomfortable because I will go sometimes just around the clock, basically. It's very, very intense.
So it's kind of like a purgative experience, and you don't have any choice but to be the vehicle through which this great writing happens.
It just, because so much information is there, in order for it to be coherent, I have to really stay in that working day satori. I think that's a fine phrase that Lilly had. Is that what it was?
Yeah, something like that.
Working day satori, or working satori, or work day satori?
No, I got it. It's professional satori.
Professional satori. Well, I get in a non-dual state, and it could be flow, but I think, frankly, I think you can have flow on gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual planes. And this is a non-dual flow. There's no question about it. And it's very, very intense. So it's not a favorite time for me, that part of it.
That's interesting. Everything has its price.
Yeah, yeah.
So what would you most like to say to a younger version of yourself? That is, to somebody just starting out exploring their interests in the fields of consciousness, subjectivity, psychology, philosophy, and the human experience. And if you could go back to the dishwashing Ken just starting to write, would you give yourself some advice? Or?
Well, I do. In the novel Boomeritis, because Boomeritis is actually written by a 20-year-old named Ken Wilber, as you'll see. The advice comes in the same two categories that we've been talking about, sort of off and on during this, which is the relative and the ultimate, or the non-dual. And for the ultimate or non-dual, the primary recommendation is take up a spiritual practice and learn to cultivate that awareness, which is not a change of state, which is ever-present noticing through all changes of state, waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. There is that timeless, unchanging presence that is your actual birthright and your original face. And the only way you can recognize that, again, because it's so utterly, utterly simple, the only way you can recognize it is to exhaust all of your other options until literally it's the only thing left staring you in the face. And then you go, shit, that's embarrassing. I've only been looking at it for 15 billion years now, and I didn't quite recognize it. Take up a spiritual practice. It can be vipassana, Zen, centering prayer, yoga. The shamanic material will work, but you really have to make sure you don't just get caught up in phenomenal passing states. And a lot of
the altered staters.
That's right. A lot of nature mystics and shamanic states come and they go. And that's not the ever-present self. The ever-present self does not come, it does not go. It's fully present right now, and it witnesses these states that come and go. If you just merely get associated with phenomenal states, that's fine, but it's not realization. So you can do it through shamanic and nature mysticism, but you have to be careful not to merely confuse some gross changing state with the unborn or the ever-present. So take up a spiritual practice and make that real. Because that's the only thing that will unravel the mystery of life and death and pain. And while you're doing that, then decide what you want to do in the manifest realm.
So that is coherent and...
Yes, on the way up and on the way down. If you have a little bit more balanced, integral approach in the manifest realm, not only will you be healthier and saner, but once you have had some sort of realization and your realization continues to deepen, you will have a bigger, nicer guitar box to make a more resonant sound when you strike the chords of your soul and spirit. So you want to have, if you're going into business, go into integral business. See how you can have an all-quadrant, all-level, all-line approach to business. It's not that hard. And once you get into it, it's actually fairly simple. It's just I, we, and it, the big three.
Beauty, truth, and goodness.
Art, morals, and science, and so on. I mean, and for that, yeah, you do need to do a little bit of study, and you can start with my books and follow up with, the thousands of other people, past and present, that are working on the integral approach.
So you've talked about 2% being second tier. Maybe we'll be moved to 7 to 8% in the next 100 years, which will have tremendous impact.
On the next decade.
Next decade. Well, so what makes the shift come about? What will actually prod the greens to go yellow? What can people do to help make that happen?
Right. One of the real mysteries of human existence is what actually does help people transform. It's a complex, mysterious process, and nobody has really figured it out. We do know a couple of sort of parameters, and one is, in order to transform from whatever stage you're at, you have to be at that stage long enough that you kind of met its basic needs. You've tasted everything from your particular stage. You kind of know what's there. You're not grasping for it anymore. You've had your full. You've eaten at that dinner table, and you're kind of ready to push it.
Satisfied swine.
Yes, exactly. So that has to be in place. Then you have to run up against the limitations. You have to constantly be realizing that you're facing questions about your existence that you can't answer from the level you're at. And you have to have a kind of a conscious dissonance has to set in. You have to be both full of that level and unhappy. Something is not right. You want more. There's more out there, and I don't want to just be stuck with where I'm at. Then there has to be generally some kind of process of conscious understanding. And it can be through psychotherapy, it could be through a contemplative practice or meditation, but some way to have an insight into the fact that you are living a narrow and relatively constricted life compared to what you could be living.
Compared to your birthright.
Compared to your birthright, certainly. And even on the relative plane, just a little nudge up is going to give you a broader expanse in the relative realm. And then finally, generally some sort of catalyst. Something happens that will trigger it, and sometimes it can be reading a book at that point. What's happened with the boomer generation is that our generation has been at the green mean for 30 years, basically. What Paul Ray calls cultural creatives, basically the green mean. And because we've been there for 30 years, we're sick of it. Everybody's sick of this, pluralistic relativism and the green meme swamp and all this kind of. People are really, really looking to get out of it, and that's good. We meet the first criteria, which is we've satisfied it, we've tasted it. Second criteria, we're unhappy. We don't like it. We want out. So all we need now is a little bit of insight and understanding into the situation, and hopefully that's frankly what some of these books can offer. Whether you read Bob Keegan's book, or read Spiral Dynamics, or read Boomeritis for that matter. And you get a little bit of insight into the fact that you can make this transition to second tier and then ultimately third tier.
Do you think, though, there might be a book, like, let's say, as popular as The Celestine Prophecy was, but that was truly an integral book, and that could, what a fellow named David Rowell said, if second tier is only a small percent, then how can it encourage progress in the first tier in an honest, forthright way when first tier can't yet understand second tier concepts?
Right. That's exactly right. And what I think can happen, yes, I think there can be a Celestine prophecy of a second tier. And I think, because what's going to happen is if we take that 25% of Americans that are at the green mean, that's some 50 million Americans, and if even about a third of them are green exit, ready to pop, that's 15, 20 million Americans that are ready for second tier. And that means that 2% can go to 5, 6, 7, 8% in the next decade. And I really believe that that is a possibility. And it's certainly one of the things that we're trying to do at Integral Institute is position ourselves at the forefront of that incoming second tier wave. So that I think when that wave starts, roughly in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9,
people have something to turn to.
We'll have some stuff. We'll have some products, some text, some presentations, some multimedia stuff, and increasing books that will help them orient to this second tier, more integral existence, and how to apply it in business, in education, in relationships, in therapy, and so on. And then somebody will come along, and there will be a series of very popular things. I mean, there will be the Jonathan Livingston Seagull, all these kinds of very popular things, even written on a third grade level, but they will speak to that.
Sure.
Truly integral impulse. I don't think I can do that. I think I'm.
You're not the popularizer.
I don't think I could do it that well. But I think some people will be doing it. I really do.
What do you think about the internet and its transformative potentialities, and how could it be used better? I mean, Enlightenment.com, we're saying that if we give people access to everything that's out there, then they will know which pieces they want to try so that they can move forward. That's just one way of going about it. I mean, my sense is that the internet could be the greatest transformative tool humans have devised, but we just haven't figured out how to go about doing it yet.
I think there's going to be a couple things that's going to happen that will really put it into a whole other dimension, so to speak. The downside of the internet right now is it's not a full-bodied communication. So it's disembodied, it's agentic, it's abstract in a certain way.
Sorry, what was that second word you said?
Agentic.
Yeah.
Agency, communion.
Oh, okay.
It's more of the agency side.
Got it.
And so it makes it very hard to get really engaged in profound types of transformation, because the fact is that when you're really working with human transformation, there's a component of it that is physical to physical presence. It's not all the whole story, but it's an important part of it. And there's a transmission that occurs between human beings on a etheric, emotional, subtle level of energy.
Anything from pheromones to
subtle
bodies
all of it.
to
all of it. And the simple resonance of the precious human body being next to another one. And all of that gets screened out on the net right now.
That's why we have some of, let's say, Charlie Tart talking about a few things. You get to watch him, even in a little window, doing his rap. You get so much more of what he's about.
What I think we're going to eventually have is, I think there are going to be ways that we can transmit full-bodied presence over the net. And there's actually some very interesting technologies coming out. Bob Richards with the Claris stuff in terms of what you can do with a CD in terms of sound. It's really rather astonishing. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but Bob has a technology that they discovered when they were working with the energy of the chakras, basically, and trying to see what aspects of that energy that they could actually physically, what aspects they could reproduce in, basically mechanically, in very subtle machines. And the upshot of it, besides coming out with several different types of technologies that are very interesting, is there's one type of subtle energy that basically reduces the level of noise in any information transfer system. So what happens if you take a CD, for example, which is already a very clear sounding sound, and you put it in this field, all of a sudden you're sitting here listening to the CD to your ears, and you put it in that field, you start feeling it with your whole body. You actually listen to this CD with your entire body. It's a very, very wild sensation. And it's very addictive. Once you actually get in that field, and then you go back to just listening with your ears, you go, oh, tin, don't like it, don't like that at all. It's much more real what the sound that you'd actually get in being in the presence of another human being. So that's an example of the type of technology. We combine that with holographic imaging, with this full-bodied technology of information transfer. And I think at that point, people will be able to call up Suzuki Roshi giving meditation instructions.
Okay, we're back.
We're back.
Okay, we were talking about subtle sciences and fully embodied ways of transferring experiences
so
over
once
the web.
if you combine this capacity for a more full-bodied information transfer to the extent that that can happen, and then you mix it with something like a holographic image, I think you're going to get at least a lot more capacity for human-to-human interaction over the net. And under those circumstances, then I think the transformative power of the net will become quite large. Right now, there are really two main things that the net have done, well, three, but one is it's helped business-to-business stuff quite a bit. I mean, it's sort of bizarre that the main economic impact of the net has been to help General Electric be much more efficient in what it does. And Jack Welch will be the first to tell you this. The cutting-edge network and web stuff that's being done at GE, and it's painful to all of the Silicon Valley types, which like to think of kind of the coming transformation and all of that. But what it's really done so far is help General Motors and General Electric be better at what they're doing. And the people that have had any sort of success on the net are Kmart and that kind of thing. So that's number one. Number two, as simple information transfer, it's quite extraordinary, and it's empowered, not hugely, but to a modest degree, it's empowered average citizens to find out more about items that previously only professionals had access to. The biggest change that's happened is in how people relate to their medical illnesses. Because as soon as they get sick, they get on the net and they find out within about 24 hours, they know 10 times more than their doctor knows about the disease that they've got. And they go into the office and they shake these doctors up. And they'll go, here's the latest treatment techniques, here's what's going on, here's what's going on. And I think it's a completely terrific thing. And I think we're going to have to very, very fast evolve a new type of medical practice to handle this. It's going to really have to be very much more partnership between the guy who has the power of the prescription pad and the people who are in fact doing most of the research on their own disease.
But wouldn't the same kind of model apply to people doing different types of psychospiritual practices and disciplines? And especially if they really use the net to create sangha, a community among themselves. I mean, that's what I'm seeing, is there's no place on the web still where I want to hang out all the time, which is why I keep trying to build that place.
Right. Oh, I think that can happen, but that's a little bit different model, because if you're working with psychospiritual growth, generally to some degree, for some period, you need a teacher in the flesh doing that. Whereas on the medical model, all you really want from this guy is a prescription. It's a little different kind of scenario. Now, obviously, if you need surgery or something, then that's a different type of thing. But we can come back to what a community could be on the net. But I was just pointing out the main effects that the net have had on the world at large has been those, and the information transfer. And the third has been to completely splinter and fragment society to an unprecedented degree.
Sure.
Yeah. And increase hate groups exponentially.
Right, they can find each other really easily.
They can find each other, and that is a real problem. So the bright promise of the net really hasn't even begun in terms of what it can do for human-to-human transformation. And again, I don't think that's going to happen for a while, but I think it's going to be very, very important when it does happen. In terms of building the kind of community you're building, again, part of the difficulty is that what we call the consciousness movement in general, as you know, really is a dozen different groups.
Or dozen.
It's hundreds, but it's, a dozen big sort of general reflections. And none of them really get along that well with each other.
Right. They all think they have the answer, the truth.
And it's a problem because it's so far it's just being treated as, a catch-all. It's all the new age, or it's all whatever the single phrase is. And it's really not at all. And so it makes it's kind of it balkanizes economic models, because people want to go in and say, look, how can we reach these 50 million people that are involved in all this stuff? Whereas, as a matter of fact, these 50 million people are really very, very heterogeneous. And there's no one community is going to get to them. And then you have to start actually narrowing down what you're trying to do and the audience you're trying to reach. Because otherwise what happens is you alienate everybody by trying to be everything to everybody. So on the one hand, you do what we're trying to do at Integral Institute, which is we're trying to be as explicit and as upfront as we can and say, based on just everybody's group consensus, we're trying to find the best second-tier and third-tier thinkers that we can right now. Right now, frankly, we're an elite think tank. That's all. And we're not pretending to be anything else. Once we produce integral products, integral book on business, medicine, law, and so on, then we want to create an integral community that's not going to be elitist or think tank or anything like that at all. But right now it is. That makes it very easy for us to find our audience. It makes it very easy for us to come up with business models, and makes it very easy for us to focus what we're doing. But once you move out into a larger market, a larger audience, it becomes very, very difficult, very confusing, as you know, because you're trying to build a site that can be a happy home for a fair number of people pursuing these. But right there that you get these internal tensions then, where the things that will attract some people will really turn others off, and vice versa. It's very, very difficult.
Yeah, it's difficult to not offend people when you're talking about their religions.
Yeah.
And any type of way, attempt to systematize it or rate it, which we're going to try to do, is fraught with difficulty. But then again, it could yield some interesting data and help people.
Right.
You just kind of go ahead and do it. Can you say a little bit more about psychedelics? I don't know if you want to talk about your own personal experiences, if any, and what you think of the government's current position, and also the notion of conscious, sacred, guided use, either by psychotherapists or religious practitioners.
Right. I'm sort of well known as not having a whole lot of experience with psychedelics. I've written about what I think was one very large LSD trip in college that I wasn't particularly fond of. But I never really did any psychedelics at all, not even sort of experimentally. Not because I didn't want to or anything. It just really, wasn't sort of in the cards for me. That changed a bit when I moved to, as you might imagine, when I moved to Marin in the early 1980s and stayed with Roger and Francis, who are advocates of conscious drug use done, carefully in sophisticated fashion. Under all the right settings. And they were pretty instrumental in getting me to try MDMA. That's the only drug I've had any experience with. It was completely legal in 1983 when I did. I probably did a dozen trips, and I thought it was absolutely wonderful. I just absolutely loved it. And there tends to be a kind of diminishing return experience on that drug. I think a lot of people do it for a while, and then they just sort of, if had enough, they've learned what they could learn from it, and they just sort of stopped doing it. And I stopped doing it in 1984 and have had no desire to do it since then. But my sense is that the people I know that have done it responsibly have gained a lot from using psychedelics to open up a certain space. But there are downsides, and particularly in this movement, what you find is that there are two general approaches to consciousness studies. One is the druggies, and one is the meditators. And the druggies are into altered states, and the meditators are into stages. And the meditators believe that you have to actually discipline and work, and it's 4 years, 10 years, and 15 years to reach stable realization of these higher, something out. And the psychedelic or drug side is much more into altered states, ayahuasca, LSD, any sort of number of altered states. They don't tend to get into permanent realizations based on these things. And I happen to believe that both of these models, I use states and stages, I believe both of them are required. But there's kind of an acrimony between these two groups. There are very few people that do drugs and are serious meditators. And the people that only do drugs, I think eventually it kind of tends to catch up in a way. I don't see permanent realization coming from these things. I don't see permanent access to some of these higher states. And I think at some point the simple neurological noise of the ingredients starts to almost outshine the luminosity that was there perhaps at the beginning. And so the people I know that I've watched over 30 years that have done only drugs have become increasingly, frankly, unpleasant people and disillusioned and sad in certain ways. It's not to say that meditators do all that much better, but there is at least a chance with meditators that you can have a permanent realization that is enduring and not merely a transitory state. And I think people do better if they either have a judicious combination of the two or if they do mostly meditation. And my recommendation is don't just do drugs, because people get in trouble. And the theories that I see coming out of people that just do drugs are frankly pretty wacky theories. They don't take enough evidence into account. They're not inclusive enough. They don't include other types of data and evidence. And I think they're very partial.
The Q-Link, plug for our friend Bob.
Right.
You're wearing one right now?
Yeah.
So am I. Do you think it works?
Yes, I believe that.
We touched them to each other. I mean, have you read the science on the site and spoken to Bob, and you feel that it does do roughly what it says it should do?
Yeah. My feeling is that, again, what we do is follow the evidence. And you know, Bob and I have known each other for a long time, and he, from the beginning, has agreed that what you really do is you just go out and get as much evidence as you can on what these things do. So the amount of scientific evidence on it so far is small, but very, very promising. And you've seen some of it on TV and stuff. One of my favorites is you put people in front of a computer screen, you know, and for 12 hours or something, take a sample of their blood, look at it under a microscope, and it's very, very sad.
Right, those who do and those who don't wear Q-Links have different...
It's unmistakable. It's really... And the BBC did a whole news broadcast on it where they brought their doctors and had them independently do it. And the people without the Q-Link, their red blood cells, you know, look all dented and schmooshed, and it's really pretty scary. And the people wearing the Q-Link, it reversed in like 3 hours and stuff. So.
I mean, what I find is that I don't like to go out without it.
Yeah, I know,
whether or not it's real...
very magical. It awakens the purple meme in everybody.
It does, doesn't it? Talking about things that have some evidence, cities in general, powers. One of the people who asked me a question said, well, what do you think about, you know, there's a lot of good evidence for cities and for psi in general, and what about focusing on that as a way to get people into interior dimensions in general? So the evidence is good enough that it should bring hard-nosed, you know, reductionist empiricists around, but it doesn't.
It doesn't. It's very strange. And I had there was actually... Roger Walsh called because the UC Irvine had been given, I don't know, $500,000 grant or something to do another, you know, series of psychic research. And so Roger was calling people saying, you know, what they really want to do is come up with the experiment that would just prove once and for all that, you know, psychic events happen. And they were trying to sort of have a little informal discussion about what should that experiment be, you know, new ways to bend spoons or make, you know, dice show up the right number of times. And I said basically that I think that was just that was a misuse of money, because the real problem is that we have meta-analysis on psychic phenomena.
Yeah, Dean Radin's book.
It completely puts it beyond dispute, and every statistician agrees. So I said, take your $500,000 and buy a fucking PR firm.
Right.
Because you people just have bad press. Another experiment's not going to change. It's already 100% certain. Another experiment's not going to make it more certain. Right. What you do have is a massive resistance to these kinds of things.
Right.
And what you really need is an education system, a PR system, an advertising, if you will, in the best sense of the word, to do that. And frankly, a lot of the money that we're allocating at Integral Institute, large portions of it are for research, but large portions of it are, in the best sense of the word, PR, education. We've got to get the word out about this stuff. I happen to think that psychic phenomena, and I think Mike Murphy and I have a friendly kind of disagreement here. Mike is very interested in these, and he thinks that continuing to get the word out on them, because it really is very compelling, that people would just come around to seeing that. And I think just the opposite. I think people just look at it and go, oh, that's really spooky, and they just run away from it.
It can't be real, so it's not real. And any
Exactly.
evidence you have has to be fake.
Exactly.
And the whole thing has been going on for 50 years.
The approach that I've found, none of them are very good, but one of the approaches that can at least reach a certain type of audience is the developmental approach. Because once you have evidence that there are, let's say, 8 stages of development in certain aspects, somebody can always go, how about 9? I mean, and once you start investigating these upper stages, they invariably start looking very spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And they do. And it convinces a lot of people, like Lawrence Kohlberg, who famously added a 7th stage. That's one way to do it. Another way is to do brain-mind research, because when the TM people showed that there was a 4th state of consciousness, different from waking, dreaming, deep sleep, the transcendental state of meditation, and that it had a physiological thing, yes, and that got published in Science magazine, that did more than every Upanishad ever written to convince a certain type of Western mind that there's something real going on. So I think a judicious look at that kind of research and presentation is very, very important. And frankly, I don't think cities helps that much, even though I think, you know, the evidence is compelling, but I think it just freaks people out in a certain sense. Kind of funny, actually.
Well, it would just be like if we found out that we actually were reading it, I believe, all the time.
Yeah, well, which we probably are, you know. I mean.
Well, my dear mother, for example, whenever something psychic happens to her, when she tries to tell me about it, she always says, and it happened, and I knew it ahead of time, and I go, I know that, Mom. And then she keeps telling it to me so that I'll freak out too, and I don't freak out because these things happen all the time, and there's nothing to be done about it. Why 4 quadrants? I mean, is that
right.
Your model is? I mean, you know, like taking a Kabbalistic look, that every number is magical. When I worked at Gnosis, I found that there were people who championed every number. Right. You know, you could do a 5 quadrant. You know, people want you probably to do a quintessence thing. Right. Your 4 is a good, logical, strong place to rest. I mean, you're going to stick with that.
Well, I've said a couple things. One is that all holons have at least 4 dimensions, the 4 quadrants. I haven't said they only have 4. But the way I arrived at 4 was, if you're sort of building a universe, I mean, what kind of distinctions do you need to get a manifest world going at all? G. Spencer Brown, that wonderful Laws of Form, it's a really a work of genius, everybody agrees, basically said a universe comes into existence when a distinction is made. A line, a boundary is drawn, and that allows a manifest world to exist. And the simplest kinds of boundaries you can draw are between inside and outside, and singular and plural. It's just you sort of need those before you can get anything else going.
So is it possible that your philosophy, your theory of everything, is just a well-elaborated version of what it is if you do those 2 distinctions, and that there could be entirely different, more philosophies than we dreamed of?
I've never said that there weren't others. There could be. But say at the very least, this is what happens. We have insides and we have outsides, and we have singulars and we have plurals. And if you put at every dimension, as far as we can tell, even the dream world has that if you look at it. Even hallucination will have it. There's an inside, and then you see somebody else as an outside. There's singular and there are plurals running around. So you have the 4 quadrants in all dimensions. I claim that the 4 dimensions of the 4 quadrants go all the way down. I believe quarks have an inside and an outside, and I believe they're singular and plural. And that's why I believe consciousness goes all the way down, because insides go all the way down. So basically using that analysis it turns out that it shakes down into very, very common things like the big 3, the good, the true, and the beautiful, first person, second person, third person, and so on. These are dimensions that all human cultures recognize, probably because they're very real dimensions. And what I found a way of doing is just finding a little simpler way to state it, the inside and outside, singular and plural, and come up with a little 4-quadrant diagram. And for me, the importance of that is not that it has to be religiously believed or anything like that at all, but it's just a reminder of saying, in any approach to reality, are you touching all 4 of these bases? Because if you're not, you're leaving something out important. And when you leave it out, it's going to boomerang come back at you in unconscious ways that you're going to regret. And so it's just a way to help us remember to be a little more comprehensive, a little bit more inclusive, make sure we're touching bases with these four important dimensions of all whole ones. And it's just it's saner, basically. It's healthier to do that. So, but there could be, I've had people say, oh, now there are 6, and they add 6, and then there are 8. That's okay. I don't care.
Yeah, some people are writing questions into me about, what about the relationship between, the intersubjective and the, and it goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
Well, what about sort of a third group, people who do kind of the New Age seminar world, whether it was EST or now Landmark or Insight or Actualizations or Avatar or, there's lots of systems out there that people are paying lots of money in. Certainly when people go into these things, they have heart-opening and mind-blowing experiences.
Right.
And, there does seem to be sort of a seminar effect, which means as long as you're participating in the group and doing your work or selling your thing, you get it. But then when you go away from it, it's like there's nothing, you learn some language maybe some skills, but it doesn't seem to produce.
That's one of the things that is a good area, for research. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we'd like to do at Integral Institute is investigate just that type of experience. And I'll give you another type of research that we'd like to do. I've talked with several people about this, including Andrew Cohen, and Andrew's very interested in pursuing this. If you take something like spiral dynamics, it's just one example of aspects of developmental stages, and you take somebody, you give them the spiral dynamics test, you give, let's say, 200 people go to one of Andrew Cohen's week-long meditation.
Right.
Andrew will be the first to tell you that of all the people that come to him, maybe some percentage get it and some percentage don't. Let's just say the percentage is 5%. Of the people that come through actually get what he's saying and stay with him and work and get some sort of realization. And this is how I put it to Andrew when we were talking about it. What if you gave the spiral dynamics test and you found out that the people that got what you were doing were predominantly turquoise, mm-hmm. and that the others just didn't get it? I said, now wouldn't you want to know that ahead of time? Wouldn't you want to have some sort of way that you could dramatically increase the people that you're effective with? And perhaps cut down on those that you're not as effective with. Right. And maybe other people that are orange do great with Hatha Yoga. Who knows?
But that's the most appropriate vehicle for them.
The question is, it's a question, the point is that it's a question of research right now. We don't want to get too, crazy about this kind of research because you don't want to pigeonhole people and you don't want to prematurely cut people off or anything like that. But we're getting to a point where we have so much information about states of consciousness and stages of consciousness and types of factors that influence transformation that we can be much more helpful to a larger number of people if we have some of this research being done. And so it might be, for example, that Avatar works with a particular type of person. They get a good opening, but then if they don't do certain kinds of follow-up, then it dissipates, mm-hmm. for example. And I think we're at a point now where we can start to look into some of these questions using some of the tools we have, because we have an awful lot of investigative tools now to help people chart, how they're doing in their consciousness growth and unfolding. And some people will always be put off by the whole, it's too Orwellian for them, and they think you're trying to control them, and they don't want to be hemmed in by stages and all that. And that's fine too. Nobody has to do this. But I would like to know, for example, how I'm doing, where I'm at, where I need help,
I once asked Charlie Tart about this, and he said it would take tens and tens of millions of dollars, and they're not likely to get that kind of money to do this research.
That's correct, but we had $100 million last year, so that's exactly what we're going to do with it. If we had that, we would put tens and then there are $8 exactly to this.
That'll be a good day. Well, any final words, Ken? Let's wrap this up. Anything you'd like to say to the masses?
Just delighted to share this time with you.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Possible doing work in this field, the general field of integral studies and integral endeavors. And that's one of the reasons that I started Integral Institute, was to act as a funding source for people doing this kind of work, because the marketplace doesn't reward truly integral studies at all. It rewards sort of New Age approaches to it. It rewards sort of the experiential workshop approach, as it were. It rewards the green meme and the purple meme and everything in between, but it does not reward truly integral studies. So the only way we're going to get real work done in that field is, frankly, if we have funding agencies that will do that. And then once the real work is done and the research is done, and you start producing really solid texts and presentations and articles and research, then we can create a market off of that. That's going to be probably 3 years from now. So what we've done at Integral Institute, the biggest change in our orientation happened not because of the market, but quite independent of that. It's something a change we would have made whether the market went up or down. And that is, we went from being a kind of community of some 400 founding members to focusing more on producing what we call integral product, actual books, texts, academic material on in each of the 10 branches. So we're working on books in, for example, what is integral politics, what is integral business, integral medicine, integral law. Because what we found is that because there were no really strong statements about an integral approach to any of these fields.
Mm-hmm. Which is one of the reasons why academics can ignore it completely.
It can ignore it completely, and the other thing we found is that most people with very, very good intentions would simply take what they're doing and call it integral, mm-hmm. when it really wasn't. They were leaving out certain aspects of the human condition that ought not to be left out, and we could demonstrate that to them, and they would say, okay, I guess what I'm doing is not integral. So before we can build community or create a market or have a web presence or have conferences, we have to produce specific texts in each of these 10 branches put together by one of our core teams of recognized scholars and researchers saying this is our best shot as an opening statement about what integral business is, integral politics, integral education, integral medicine, integral law, integral psychology, integral spirituality, and so on.
So that may answer this next question I got. It's April 16th, 2001, and we're in Boulder, Colorado, and we have the wonderful privilege of being with Ken Wilber in his home, and we're going to get to spend some time asking him some questions and listening to what he has to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Ken, let's start out talking about the Integral Institute. I wanted to know how I was doing in general, especially on the practical and pragmatic level in the wake of what's been happening in the stock market and people pulling money out, and how that's affected what you've been doing with II.
Well, you've also had, this can be a real dialogue because of the experiences you've had with enlightenment.com, yes?
Yes.
There are many ways to talk about the immediate impact it had on Integral Institute. One of them is that basically we lost $100 million in pledges in about a 8-month period. And it's not every day you lose $100 million. It left me feeling a little cranky and testy. Mm-hmm. In terms of what it's actually done, the scope of Integral Institute hasn't changed. And the money itself, we still have several other pledges lined up for, frankly, comparable amounts, and we'll know how these unfold over the next year. The economic situation, of course, could not be worse. It's just a crying shame that the bubble burst during this period. A lot of companies that should have gone out of business went out of business, but it took down a lot of work that was really top-notch and didn't deserve to go out in that ignoble a fashion.
So are any of your projects at II still going forward, like, let's say, the Encyclopedia of Transformation?
Sure. Yeah, we're still funding that. We're still carrying the Human Change Process core team forward. We also refer to that as the Human Transformation team. They're working on an Encyclopedia of Human Transformation, a complete literature review of all known forms of transformation for human beings. Because transformation seems to be a major concept that everybody talks about, but we really don't have a good literature review on what's out there, mm-hmm. number one. And number two, the type of research. What evidence is there that any of these things that say they transform people actually transform people? And there are a lot of different ways you can at least try to look at that and get a handle on it, and we're certainly doing that.
So in the meantime, though, let's say the grants that people could write to for II, none of that's happening while...
No. What's happening right now is one of the main things we wanted to do with that original $100 million was to get it to as many people as...
Quite a few questions from graduate students in different areas saying, I'm an anthropology grad student, and what do I do to try to bring an all-quadrants, all-level approach into my university without completely alienating the powers that be? Or how can a psychology graduate student become more involved with integral studies and help boost their the efforts in a green meme school? And it's sort of like they're dying out there for these kind of supporting materials.
That's exactly what we found. And until we have a series of really well done, well documented textbooks, if you will, on here's integral anthropology, here's integral law and criminal justice, here's integral medicine. Until we have these series of statements, the field has no traction. It has no way to really move forward. Whereas if you do have a book on integral approaches to education, for example, and it's a textbook with 8 authors, and it's we plan on having these things be, 300 and 400 pages long. We want to make a real academic statement to begin with. And again, this is not the final word, it's the opening word. It's our first approximation of what an integral approach would actually look like. It is truly all quadrant, all level, all lines, all states. Anything less than that's not going to be integral. And then once we have this kind of book on, let's say, integral anthropology, and this student calls up and says, I'm going to Arizona State, for example, I would like to take an all quadrant, all level, all line approach to anthropological research. My professors think I'm nuts. What should I do? And we say, well, give them this 400-page textbook, and here's 300 references, and here's supporting documents, and that will give them something to look at and respond to. And if they have criticisms of it, we'd love to hear it, because we're going to keep refining these things over the years. So, but we have to have a statement, a really strong academic statement to begin with, because otherwise the field is simply going nowhere, and it has gone nowhere in 30 years.
So on top of the kind of the orienting framework that you've set up, you're really hoping to fill it out so that, the reality is that if you go into Barnes & Noble's, you find your works in the New Age section. That must be really galling.
It would be, except the New Age section gets 80% more traffic than any other section.
There you go. What about audio recordings of an essential Ken Wilber? One person wrote it and said, I'm not the kind of person that absorbs reading words. I need it from other modalities. Have you thought about re-going through all of your stuff again and creating a set of audio materials for at least kind of the basic premises?
Well, one of the things that we want to do is get into multimedia as fast as we possibly can. And I can go back and give an example of the approach that Integral Institute is taking, and how that eventually will have a lot of different outlets other than textbooks, even though I'm saying we want to emphasize textbooks. That's not going to be the only thing we're doing. So we have a core team in Integral Business branch, and it's 7 or 8 very, very good people, including Leo Burke, who was at Motorola University, and Fred Studier, who's consultant at Bain Associates, very, very large consulting firm in California, Tony Schwartz with Fast Company, Bob Richards, who's the CF of our business group, Fred Kaufman, who was Peter Senge's main collaborator when they founded the Organizational Learning Center at MIT School of Business. These are some very, very sharp people. And what they've done, basically, Michael Putz at Cisco, what they've done is what we're trying to get each of the core teams to do, which is they can start by using my broad framework of all quadrants, all levels, all lines. But then based on their decades of experience in the field, in this case of business, to actually sit down and fill in all the details with actual concrete data from the world of business. And then what they're doing right now, for example, is, and they've been meeting for almost 18 months now, is creating PowerPoint presentations of what integral business leadership looks like. And these are very sophisticated presentations. Bob Richards just gave one down at Esalen conference on integral capitalism, for example. And it was a big hit down there. It went over really, really well, and people really understood why you have to have an all quadrant, all level, all line approach to any type of integral approach to economics. And so that kind of presentation has a much better chance of helping people understand these integral approaches than the 300 or 400 page textbook. So we want to try to do a very broad range of material, from the very, very dense to the very presentable.
Well, that would be in line with your general theoretical approach anyway.
Yeah.
Hit it from lots of different angles, as it were.
Right.
When will volume 2 of your trilogy be out?
Basically, the idea was to do one volume every 10 years.
Okay, so you got some time.
A little bit of time, and not as much as I liked. What happened, of course, is the Integral Institute came along, and it's really took really about the last 2 years of
a lot of your
a lot of my time.
Are you happy with your leadership of Integral Institute?
I am.
So you feel you're leading it? I mean, all along you said you wanted to try to lead it from a second tier way, which might look a little bit disorganized.
Right.
Maybe disorganized is the wrong word, but
no, I think it does, because what happens is, first of all, everybody that's involved in this has been very kind of open and flexible and easygoing about it, because the fact is there are no second-tier organizations out there. So
the Vatican?
Huh?
The Vatican?
I stand corrected. And so a lot of people have a great deal of experience in OD, organizational development, with first-tier companies. And one of my main jobs is it's actually been more than a leader. It's been kind of a curmudgeon, of putting on the brake and saying, wait a minute, we can't organize this along these first-tier principles. We can't use standard organizational development material for this.
We're not going to know what it looks like.
Well, that's the thing. So what we do have to do is just continue to put second-tier people together in a room and have them thrash out these various ideas. And you've been to meetings. That's basically what we do with the general meetings. Is we have as many second-tier people as we can find. We put them in a room. We say, here's the topic of conversation, and see what comes out of that group. And then eventually we try to translate that into institutional forms. And so, okay, now here's going to be the infrastructure in terms of what we have set up. Now, the main thing that makes it difficult for me in any position of leadership is balancing this funding situation. And that's been complicated because, on the one hand, there's this exorbitant amounts of money that have been pledged. But on the other hand, of course, it could all fall apart, as some of it has already done. Mm. So this makes it almost impossible to do any planning, frankly, that lasts much more than a couple of weeks, because that's how often the situation changes. So a lot of people sit down and say, you know, we have to have a mission statement, we have to have a strategy for the next 6 months, and I'll go, forget it. It's an absolute waste of time to do that. And so the only friction I've really had in the last year and a half is because I have to put the brake on some of these things. I think some people think that I'm not, you know, kind of getting with the program as much as we could, but it's really not the case. The situation changes dramatically every couple of weeks, and we have to be very flexible to adapt to that, because it dramatically changes what we